In the summer of 1944, the vast blue waters of the Pacific erupted in fire as the United States launched one of the most brutal and decisive island battles of the war. Saipan, a small island in the Marianas, became the stage where the fate of the Pacific shifted forever. Thousands of Marines and soldiers stormed the beaches under withering Japanese fire, while the skies above thundered with dogfights and naval guns, shook the earth for days. On this tiny patch of land, families hid in caves, civilians were caught in the inferno, and Japanese defenders fought with a ferocity that stunned the world, unleashing one of the largest Banzai charges in history. For America, the capture of Saipan meant the Japanese homeland itself was now within range of strategic bombers, a turning point that sealed the empire's fate. This is the entire story of the Battle of Saipan, the invasion, the desperate defense, the unimaginable sacrifice, and the echoes that would shape the final year of the Pacific War. So close your eyes, settle in, and let this powerful documentary carry you through every moment of courage and tragedy as you drift into sleep. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because together across oceans and generations, we keep history alive. The year 1944 marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific War, a vast conflict stretching across thousands of miles of ocean and countless islands. For nearly 3 years, the Japanese Empire had surged outward, conquering territory from Burma to the Solomon Islands, presenting itself as an unstoppable force. Yet by 1944, the tides had shifted dramatically, and the Imperial Navy found itself increasingly on the defensive. The once proud fleets that dominated Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific now struggled to hold together after catastrophic losses at Midway and the Solomon campaigns. American industrial power was overwhelming, pouring out new carriers, battleships, aircraft, and submarines at a pace Japan could never hope to match. Factories in California, Michigan, and Pennsylvania churned out tanks, planes, and warships faster than Japan could replace even a single carrier. On the Japanese home front, shortages of steel, oil, and aviation fuel crippled their ability to sustain prolonged warfare. Meanwhile, American soldiers and Marines gained invaluable combat experience from brutal campaigns in Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Gilberts. Each island seized became another stepping stone, another airfield, another staging ground for the next advance. The war had shifted from Japanese aggression to a desperate defense of their shrinking empire. The strategy of the United States in 1944 was guided by the concept of island hopping, also called leapfrogging, masterminded by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur. This approach focused on bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and instead striking at weaker, strategically located islands. By seizing islands with airfields and harbors, the Allies could project air power forward and cut off Japanese garrisons, leaving them to wither without supplies. Each new conquest extended the range of American aircraft, gradually bringing the Japanese home islands closer within striking distance. This method was brutal but efficient, sparing Allied forces from unnecessary frontal assaults on every enemy outpost. Already, victories in the Marshall Islands had demonstrated the effectiveness of the plan, with Kwajalein and Eniwetok falling into American hands. These islands became vital bases for the next stage of operations deeper into the Central Pacific. The leap from the Central Pacific to the Marianas represented not only a geographic move, but a strategic leap of monumental importance. It meant that Japan itself was no longer a distant concept, but a reachable target. The Americans were preparing to open a direct gateway to the Japanese homeland. For the Japanese leadership, 1944 was a year of dread and grim calculation. Losses at sea had been devastating. particularly the destruction of 4 frontline carriers at Midway, and the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. Experienced pilots, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been lost faster than they could be replaced. Training new aviators required time, resources, and fuel that Japan simply did not have by this stage of the war. Entire classes of young pilots were rushed through accelerated training, producing crews with little combat experience and limited hours in the cockpit. Their aircraft were often outdated or inferior to the newer American Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs rolling off US production lines. Japanese submarines, once feared, were increasingly ineffective against the massive, well-coordinated American fleets. Even worse, American submarines relentlessly targeted Japanese shipping, strangling the Empire's supply lines. Tankers carrying vital oil from the Dutch East Indies were sunk in alarming numbers, crippling Japan's ability to fuel its planes and ships. By 1944, Japan faced a war of exhaustion it could not win. The geography of the Pacific was as much a weapon as any battleship or bomber, and in 1944, geography favored the Americans. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam lay at the heart of the Japanese defensive perimeter. They were roughly 1,500 miles from Tokyo, a distance that brought the Japanese homeland within range of the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers. Capturing these islands would not only provide airfields for devastating raids on Japan, but also sever vital communication and supply routes, linking Tokyo to its southern resource areas. For Japan, holding the Marianas was a matter of survival. Losing them meant opening the door to the very heart of the empire. The island's rugged terrain and natural defenses made them ideal strongpoints, and the Japanese fortified them accordingly. Deep caves, bunkers, artillery positions, and garrisons were prepared for a fight to the death. Every man, woman, and soldier on those islands understood the stakes of the coming battle. To the Japanese leadership, Saipan in particular was the shield of the homeland. If it fell, Japan's inner sanctum would be exposed. On the American side, military and political leaders recognized the importance of striking hard in 1944 while momentum was fully in their favor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his advisors believed that victory in the Pacific could not wait indefinitely. The longer the war dragged on, the higher the human cost and the greater the risk of public fatigue. Roosevelt also understood the geopolitical stakes. The United States had to defeat Japan decisively before the Soviet Union entered the Pacific conflict, which might alter the balance of post-war influence. Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Campaign and General MacArthur's push from the Southwest Pacific were converging, with Saipan becoming the central objective. The capture of Saipan would not only advance the American war machine, but also provide a powerful political message. It would show the world, including Germany and Japan, that the United States could strike directly at the enemy's core. Behind the scenes, vast logistical preparations were underway, assembling the largest invasion force yet seen in the Pacific theater. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of ships, and thousands of aircraft would be thrown into the struggle for one small island. Saipan was about to become the epicenter of the Pacific War. For the Japanese people, 1944 brought the harsh reality of a war once thought glorious. At the beginning of the conflict, victory parades and headlines proclaimed the rising sun's invincibility. But as American bombers drew closer and supplies dwindled, daily life in Japan became a struggle against hunger and fear. Rationing grew severe, with rice and staples replaced by inferior substitutes. Blackouts and air raid drills became routine, preparing civilians for the inevitable arrival of enemy aircraft. Propaganda insisted on certain victory, yet whispers of doubt spread in factories, schools, and homes. The fall of Saipan would not just be a military setback, it would strike directly at the confidence of the Japanese population. It would demonstrate that even the empire's outer shield could not hold back American might. Morale at the home front was beginning to crack, even as the government demanded total sacrifice. Every Japanese family knew that the battles being fought in 1944 would decide the fate of the nation. Meanwhile, American morale in 1944 was high but tempered by the sobering lessons of Pacific warfare. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Kwajalein had taught the United States that Japanese defenders would not surrender easily. Every island assault cost thousands of lives, and Saipan promised to be no different, only larger and bloodier. Families back home followed the progress of the war, with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Factories ran day and night, producing the arsenal of democracy that fueled the advance across the Pacific. Letters from soldiers revealed both determination and the weariness of endless combat. For those who had fought since Guadalcanal, Saipan felt like the culmination of years of struggle. Yet there was also a sense of destiny, a belief that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. The American press described the Pacific War as entering its decisive phase, and all eyes turned to the Marianas. Saipan was the next great test of American resolve. Thus, as 1944 unfolded, the Pacific War had transformed into a struggle of endurance, resources, and willpower. Japan clung desperately to its shrinking empire, fortifying islands and urging soldiers to die rather than retreat. America, with its vast industrial machine and growing combat experience, pressed forward relentlessly, determined to bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The Mariana Islands became the linchpin, the critical objective that could decide the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese High Command understood that losing Saipan would be a catastrophe beyond repair. The Americans understood that seizing it would open the skies over Tokyo. Both sides braced for a battle unlike any seen before in the Pacific. Behind every ship and soldier lay years of sacrifice, preparation, and bloodshed. The Pacific War in 1944 was no longer about holding territory. It was about deciding the fate of nations, and the island of Saipan stood at the heart of that decision. The path to the Marianas was not a sudden leap, but the result of a carefully orchestrated series of operations across the Central Pacific. After the costly but strategic victory at Tarawa in November 1943, American planners turned their eyes westward to the Marshall Islands. Tarawa had been a bloody lesson, where underestimating Japanese defenses cost over 1,000 American lives in just 3 days of fighting. The shock of that battle forced the US Navy and Marine Corps to refine their amphibious doctrine, improve pre-invasion bombardments, and develop new tactics for reef-fringed atolls. These hard-earned lessons were put to the test in early 1944 at Kwajalein, one of the most heavily fortified islands in the Marshalls. Kwajalein Atoll was not just another patch of land in the ocean, it was a strategic anchor for Japan's defensive perimeter. Its capture would open the Central Pacific and provide staging grounds for the next great advance. American commanders knew they could not afford a repeat of Tarawa's mistakes. The road to the Marianas truly began with the decision to strike directly at the heart of the Marshall Islands. Operation Flintlock. The assault on Kwajalein began on January 31, 1944, with an immense naval and air bombardment. For days, battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers unleashed relentless fire on Japanese positions, flattening bunkers, cratering beaches, and silencing artillery. The goal was to weaken defenses enough for Marines and Army units to land with fewer casualties than at Tarawa. When the landings began on February 1st, waves of landing craft surged toward the beaches of Roy Namur in the north, and Kwajalein Island in the south. The Japanese garrison, numbering around 5,000 men, had dug themselves into a network of trenches and bunkers. Despite their determination, the ferocity of the bombardment had shattered their ability to mount organized resistance. American Marines pressed inland with grim determination, clearing pillboxes and silencing machine gun nests in brutal close combat. Roy Namur fell within 2 days, and Kwajalein Island was declared secure by February 4th. In contrast to Tarawa, where casualties had been staggering, the capture of Kwajalein demonstrated that American tactics had evolved. Kwajalein was the first true stepping stone toward the Marianas. The fall of Kwajalein was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological blow to the Japanese defense network in the Central Pacific. For Japan, the Marshall Islands had been considered a crucial barrier, fortified to resist invasion and protect the empire's inner lines. Their loss shattered illusions of impregnability and exposed the vulnerability of Japan's Pacific perimeter. Tokyo's propaganda machine, which had once trumpeted the Marshalls as an impenetrable fortress, now had to explain away a crushing defeat. American forces gained more than territory, they gained confidence. They had proven that careful planning, overwhelming firepower, and coordinated land-sea-air assaults could crack even the toughest island defenses. With airfields quickly established on the captured atoll, U.S. bombers and reconnaissance aircraft could strike deeper into enemy territory. The Marshalls were now a forward base, a staging point for even greater offensives to come. The fall of Kwajalein meant that Japan's inner defenses in the Marianas were no longer beyond reach. The road westward was now open, and the Americans were determined to march down it without hesitation. But the campaign in the Marshalls did not end at Kwajalein. To the northwest lay Eniwetok Atoll, another key Japanese stronghold with airfields and defensive positions. If Kwajalein was the gateway, Eniwetok was the corridor leading directly toward the Marianas. In February 1944, just weeks after Kwajalein fell, Admiral Raymond Spruance ordered Operation Catchpole, the assault on Eniwetok. The invasion force consisted of Marines and Army troops, supported by an armada of battleships, carriers, and transports. Once again, naval and aerial bombardment rained destruction on Japanese defenses. Though pockets of resistance remained stubborn, the Japanese garrison, roughly 3,000 strong, was well dug in and prepared for a fight to the death. The battle raged from February 17th to February 23rd, with fierce combat on islands like Engebe, Parry, and Eniwetok itself. Despite determined Japanese resistance, American forces prevailed, capturing the atoll after 6 days of hard fighting. With Eniwetok secure, the Americans had seized another vital stepping stone. The capture of Eniwetok extended American control across the entire Marshall Islands chain and brought the Marianas into the realm of possibility. From the newly established airfields, long-range bombers could now reconnoiter deeper into enemy territory and prepare the way for the next offensive. The Navy could also stage carrier groups and amphibious forces much closer to Japan's heartland defenses. For the Japanese, the fall of Eniwetok represented yet another shattering defeat in rapid succession. Their Central Pacific defensive line, carefully constructed over years, had collapsed within weeks. Tokyo's planners had miscalculated, believing that the Marshalls would bleed the Americans dry and delay their advance for months, if not years. Instead, the Americans moved with speed and precision, proving that Japanese defensive strategy was increasingly ineffective. Each loss further strained Japan's already overstretched supply lines, making it harder to reinforce or resupply isolated garrisons. The road to the Marianas was no longer a question of if but when. The Americans now stood at the threshold of Japan's inner sanctum. The victories at Kwajalein and Eniwetok also showcased the growing dominance of American naval power in 1944. The U.S. Navy's fast carrier task forces, centered around the Essex-class carriers, provided overwhelming air superiority. Waves of Hellcats, Dauntless dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes swept enemy skies clean and pounded Japanese positions relentlessly. Battleships, once considered relics after Pearl Harbor, proved invaluable in providing shore bombardments that softened enemy defenses. Amphibious tactics were refined further, with specialized landing craft, amphibious tractors, and flamethrower tanks playing critical roles. Coordination between Navy, Marines, and Army units improved dramatically, reducing confusion and bottlenecks on the beaches. Even logistics, often overlooked, demonstrated America's unmatched industrial strength, with supplies, reinforcements, and equipment flowing in seemingly endless streams. By contrast, Japan could not replace its losses, nor could it match American naval mobility. Each battle widened the gulf between the two powers, not only in material strength, but also in battlefield effectiveness. The road to the Marianas was paved with American superiority on sea, land, and air. Perhaps most importantly, Kwajalein and Eniwetok gave the Americans the forward bases they desperately needed for the next great offensive. The Marianas were not just another chain of islands, they were the key to Japan's survival. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam held airfields large enough to support the new B-29 superfortress, the most advanced long-range bomber of the war. From these islands, Tokyo itself could be bombed directly, something impossible from previous bases. American planners knew that seizing the Marianas would bring Japan within reach of sustained strategic bombing, crippling its industry and morale. For this reason, every mile gained in the Marshalls brought the Pacific War closer to its climax. The Japanese understood this as well, and they prepared to defend the Marianas with everything they had left. Kwajalein and Eniwetok were stepping stones, but Saipan would be the fortress that Japan could not afford to lose. The path to that decisive battle had now been cleared. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest confrontations of the Pacific War. Thus, the road to the Marianas was paved by blood, fire, and relentless determination. Kwajalein had proven that American amphibious doctrine could succeed, while Eniwetok demonstrated that the Japanese defense perimeter was fragile. Each victory expanded American power and shrank Japan's options, compressing the empire into an ever-tightening noose. The Marshall Islands, once thought secure, became forward bases for the storm that was about to sweep across the Pacific. To the American fighting man, these battles were milestones on a long and painful road home. Each island conquered, bringing the war closer to its end. To the Japanese soldier, they were grim reminders that the empire was bleeding, its defenses falling one after another, despite heroic resistance. For the high commands on both sides, the meaning was unmistakable. The next clash would decide far more than territory. The Marianas represented the key to Japan's heart, its cities, its industries, and its people. The Americans had opened the door. Now, they were ready to walk through it with fire and steel. Saipan was not merely another island in the Pacific. It was a geographic jewel with immense strategic value. Located in the Mariana Islands chain, Saipan sat roughly 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, close enough to place the Japanese homeland within range of the new American B-29 superfortress bombers. Unlike many small atolls scattered across the Pacific, Saipan was large, fertile, and rugged, with an area of about 46 square miles. Its varied terrain, from sandy beaches to towering cliffs and a central mountain ridge, offered both natural defensive positions and ample space for military construction. More importantly, its flat plains and open areas provided ideal ground for building massive airfields, something smaller islands like Tarawa or Kwajalein could never accommodate. The Japanese had already recognized this and constructed a Saitō airfield, which became a centerpiece of their defense. Whoever held Saipan controlled not just the Marianas but also the air over the western Pacific. From its shores, supply lines could be cut, communication routes severed, and the balance of the war tilted irreversibly. For the Americans, Saipan represented the key to striking Japan directly at its industrial heart. For the Japanese, its defense meant survival itself. The geography of Saipan gave it unique importance compared to other islands captured during the US island hopping campaign. Unlike the coral atolls of the Gilberts and Marshalls, Saipan had fertile soil, fresh water, and room for agriculture, sustaining both military garrisons and civilians. This meant that Japan had long considered Saipan a colony worth developing, filling it with sugar plantations and factories operated under Japanese administration. Its deep-water port at Tanapag Harbor made it a valuable naval base capable of anchoring warships and resupply vessels. The island's proximity to the neighboring islands of Tinian and Guam created a triangle of defensive positions, each capable of supporting the others. Together, the three islands formed the backbone of Japan's Central Pacific defense system. For the United States, seizing Saipan would mean breaking that backbone and opening a direct corridor to the Philippines and beyond. Geography turned this small island into a decisive battlefield. In the Pacific War, where distance defined strategy, Saipan was the bridge that brought Tokyo into reach. The island's location was not incidental. It was the very reason it had to be taken at any cost. Another reason Saipan was so vital lay in the skies above it. The introduction of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress fundamentally reshaped American strategy in 1944. Unlike earlier bombers, the B-29 had a range of over 3,000 miles, heavy defensive armament, and the ability to carry enormous payloads at high altitudes. However, to use this weapon effectively, the United States needed bases close enough to Japan's industrial core. Saipan provided exactly that, offering the space and terrain to construct vast runways capable of handling the largest aircraft in the world. Once operational, these airfields would allow sustained bombing campaigns over Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other critical industrial hubs. For Japan, the implications were catastrophic. Factories, refineries, and urban centers could be reduced to ashes, crippling the war economy. Thus, the battle for Saipan was not just about seizing ground, it was about unleashing a new era of strategic bombing. The island was the hinge on which the air war against Japan would turn. Without Saipan, the B-29 had no viable base. With Saipan, Japan's cities lay within reach of destruction. Japan's military leaders were acutely aware of Saipan's significance, which is why they fortified it heavily. The island's garrison included more than 30,000 troops under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saitō, supported by artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Civilian settlers, many of whom were Japanese colonists, numbered in the tens of thousands, further entangling the population into the war effort. The Japanese fortified the beaches, dug caves into the cliffs, and built extensive bunker networks to resist invasion. They knew that losing Saipan would bring American bombers to the gates of the homeland, something Tokyo could not allow. Japanese strategy dictated that Saipan be defended to the last man, a sacrifice to buy time and perhaps blunt the American advance. Every ridge, cave, and field was prepared as a killing ground for invaders. For the Japanese command, Saipan was more than an island, it was the shield of the home islands. If it fell, the path to Japan lay open. The defenders were told to fight to the death, and the civilians were indoctrinated to prefer suicide over capture. From the American perspective, Saipan was the key that unlocked both strategic bombing and naval dominance. By seizing it, the US could project air power deep into Japanese territory, while simultaneously securing a forward base for its fleet. The island's capture would sever Japan's supply lines from the southern resource areas, cutting off oil, rubber, and food shipments essential for survival. Furthermore, Saipan's location allowed the US to isolate and bypass other Japanese strongholds, such as Truk, once considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific. With Saipan in American hands, Japanese bases further south became irrelevant, their garrisons left to starve without supplies. This was the essence of island hopping: strike at the heart, and let the outposts collapse on their own. Military planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor understood that seizing Saipan would have ripple effects across the Pacific theater. It would not only bring Japan within bombing range, but also secure the Central Pacific as a launching point for the liberation of the Philippines. Saipan was not just one island among many, it was the cornerstone of the entire Pacific strategy. Politically, the capture of Saipan carried weight far beyond the battlefield. President Roosevelt and his administration knew that the American public demanded progress and visible victories. Taking Saipan would demonstrate that the war was advancing steadily toward Japan itself, providing reassurance to families weary of casualty lists. For Japan, losing Saipan would trigger political upheaval at home, as it would expose the failure of the Imperial Army to defend the empire's outer perimeter. Indeed, many Japanese leaders feared that the fall of Saipan would lead directly to a crisis of confidence in the government. As later events proved, those fears were well-founded. The defeat at Saipan would contribute to the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Toyo. Thus, the battle was not only military, but also deeply political, shaping the future leadership of both nations. Saipan's fate would influence decisions made in Tokyo and Washington alike. It was a single island with the power to alter the course of the Pacific War. In 1944, that made it priceless. The civilians of Saipan also added to the island's complexity. Tens of thousands of Japanese settlers, as well as indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian people, lived on the island under Japanese administration. For the Japanese colonists, Saipan was both home and fortress, a place where they had been told to resist the invaders at all costs. Propaganda painted Americans as monsters, instilling terror among civilians about what capture would mean. This would later lead to tragic mass suicides at Marpi Point, where families leapt to their deaths rather than surrender. For the Americans, the presence of civilians created both a humanitarian concern and a tactical problem. Every advance had to contend with the possibility of non-combatants being caught in the crossfire. Yet, in strategic terms, civilians made Saipan even more important. Their presence symbolized Japan's claim to the island as part of its empire. By seizing it, America was not just capturing military ground, it was stripping Japan of territory it considered its own. This made the battle deeply personal for both nations. Thus, Saipan emerged as the pivotal prize in the Pacific Campaign of 1944. Its geography provided natural defenses and fertile ground for massive air bases. Its location placed Tokyo within reach of devastating air raids. Its capture would sever supply lines, cripple Japanese morale, and destabilize the government in Tokyo. For the Japanese, it was the shield of the homeland. For the Americans, it was the gateway to victory. The island's airfields would launch the most destructive bombing campaign in history, culminating in firestorms that reduced cities to ashes. The battle for Saipan was never going to be just another clash over coral and sand. It was the struggle for the very future of the Pacific War. Every general, every sailor, and every pilot understood its significance. Saipan was the crossroads of strategy, geography, and politics. And in June of 1944, that crossroads became the site of one of the fiercest battles the Pacific would ever witness. By early 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into a contest of strategic philosophies, where every decision carried the weight of empires. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff clung to a doctrine of attrition, believing that decisive battles fought near the Japanese homeland could exhaust American willpower. They envisioned each island fortress as a trap, where US forces would bleed themselves against reinforced defenses, only to be struck by counterattacks from surviving naval forces. This vision, rooted in Japan's tradition of decisive battle doctrine, was shaped by memories of Tsushima and the hope of replicating that glory. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz embraced a radically different approach, one built not on gradual confrontation, but on relentless direct thrusts deep into enemy territory. For Nimitz, mobility was the new law of naval warfare, with air power and amphibious innovation replacing static defense. Rather than being drawn into battles of attrition, Nimitz sought to outpace and outthink his opponent, seizing key objectives before Japan could react. The contrast between these philosophies would define the Marianas campaign, as one side braced for siege while the other engineered a lightning advance. This was more than a clash of fleets. It was a clash of minds, doctrines, and visions for the future of war. And on Saipan, these strategies would collide with devastating consequences. Japan's defense doctrine centered around the concept of the absolute national defense zone, a line of islands stretching through the Marianas, Carolines, and western New Guinea. Military planners argued that by fortifying this arc, Japan could create an impenetrable shield around its inner empire, protecting supply lines and preserving its core territories. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became essential jewels in this defensive belt, their geography offering natural harbors and the potential for vast airfield networks. The Japanese believed that if the Americans broke through this zone, the home islands themselves would lie within reach of US bombers. As a result, immense resources were poured into reinforcing Saipan, turning it into what Tokyo envisioned as a fortress island. Concrete bunkers, artillery emplacements, underground command posts, and interwoven cave systems transformed its rugged landscape into a layered defense. Thousands of Japanese troops, many battle-hardened from earlier campaigns, were stationed on the island with orders to resist to the last man. This doctrinal rigidity emphasized endurance and sacrifice, believing that even defeat could delay the US juggernaut. But what Tokyo failed to grasp was that the Americans were not coming to be delayed, they were coming to strike directly at the empire's heart. Admiral Nimitz, in sharp contrast, was guided by speed, precision, and a cold understanding of logistics. His Central Pacific drive had already demonstrated how overwhelming air and sea power could neutralize Japanese strongholds without the need for prolonged sieges. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, he had shown that well-coordinated amphibious assaults, backed by carrier aviation and naval gunfire, could crush defenders in days rather than months. For Nimitz, Saipan represented the natural extension of this doctrine, a stepping stone that would put B-29 superfortresses within striking distance of Tokyo. He envisioned bypassing less critical outposts, isolating them to wither on the vine, while concentrating force on islands that offered strategic returns disproportionate to the risks. This approach required immense confidence in American industrial superiority, as losses could be swiftly replaced, while Japan's shrinking fleet could not. Nimitz's strategy was inherently offensive, seeking to break the enemy's defensive rhythm and force him into unfavorable battles. Where the Japanese clung to static lines, Nimitz embraced maneuver, momentum, and flexibility. It was a doctrine that reflected not just tactical insight, but the industrial and cultural confidence of the United States in 1944. The Japanese Navy, under Admiral Seimu Toyoda, placed its faith in a counterstrike doctrine that had already been weakened by earlier losses. The idea was simple: lure the Americans into attacking the Marianas, then concentrate surviving carriers, battleships, and land-based aircraft to deliver a crushing blow. It was a desperate attempt to replay the glory of earlier naval victories, even though the strategic balance had shifted dramatically. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would be the practical expression of this doctrine, as Japan attempted to destroy the US fleet through sheer audacity. Yet the doctrine was flawed from the outset, relying heavily on aircraft and pilots Japan no longer had in sufficient quality. Training pipelines had collapsed, fuel shortages crippled operations, and the once proud carrier arm was a shadow of its former self. Still, the Japanese clung to their belief in one last decisive clash, convinced that spiritual resolve could compensate for material weakness. This fixation blinded them to the adaptability of Nimitz's plan, which had no intention of playing into their hands. By 1944, the war was no longer about singular battles. It was about sustained campaigns, where production lines mattered as much as admirals. At the heart of this clash of doctrines lay the question of time. Japan needed to delay, to prolong the war, until America tired of its staggering cost in lives and treasure. Every fortified island, every garrison told to fight to the death, was part of this calculus. By contrast, Nimitz's bold thrust aimed to shorten the war by bypassing and overwhelming these defenses, reducing Japan's capacity to resist faster than it could rebuild. In this sense, Saipan was not merely a battle over geography, it was a battle over tempo. Could Japan impose a grinding pace that stretched American endurance, or could the US strike so deeply and so fast that resistance collapsed? The Marianas thus became the test case for both visions, and in the crucible of Saipan, the American thrust would prove faster, deadlier, and more strategically decisive than Tokyo could have feared. It was a collision of philosophies, each side wagering their survival on the outcome. American confidence in this thrust was underpinned by logistics, something the Japanese doctrine consistently underestimated. Saipan lay nearly 1,500 miles from Tokyo, but to the US Navy, this was simply another problem solved by floating dry docks, underway replenishment, and convoys stretching across the Pacific. The Japanese believed their defensive belt was too distant for the US to sustain, imagining that supply chains would collapse under the strain. But Nimitz's logistical machine defied these expectations, creating a mobile infrastructure that could move oceans with the fleet. This advantage made static defense obsolete, as no fortress could outlast an enemy with endless shells, bombs, and reinforcements. Japan's doctrine treated warfare as a test of courage and sacrifice, but America's approach treated it as a matter of engineering and organization. Saipan, therefore, was not just a clash of navies, but a clash of industrial age realities against outdated assumptions. Yet, despite these flaws, Japan's commanders believed they could extract a psychological victory from Saipan. They hoped that by inflicting heavy casualties on the American invasion force, they could shake public opinion in the United States. If families saw their sons dying in tropical sands far from home, perhaps they would demand peace. This thinking echoed the lessons of earlier wars, where casualty figures could sway politics as much as battlefield victories. But in America of 1944, such hopes were misplaced, as war had become a national crusade framed in terms of total victory. Nimitz and his commanders understood this reality, and they refused to allow delays or bloody stalemates to undermine momentum. Every operation was designed with overwhelming firepower, ensuring that no single island could halt the advance. Japan's defensive doctrine assumed a fragile enemy spirit. Nimitz's thrust assumed a determined, relentless adversary. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic for Japan. Thus, as fleets gathered in the Pacific in the summer of 1944, Saipan became the point where two incompatible doctrines would test their validity. Tokyo envisioned endurance, sacrifice, and counterstrikes, imagining a defensive arc that could hold forever. Nimitz envisioned penetration, momentum, and direct strikes, confident that American resources could grind down any resistance. Both sides carried the weight of history, culture, and national destiny in their strategies. The outcome would not merely decide the fate of Saipan, but redefine the balance of power in the Pacific. For Japan, it was the last chance to preserve the illusion of strategic initiative. For the United States, it was the next step in a march that would end in Tokyo Bay. The battle ahead was therefore more than tactical. It was civilizational, and in the deep blue waters and jagged ridges of Saipan, the world would witness which doctrine belonged to the past and which to the future. By the spring of 1944, the United States had learned the painful lessons of amphibious warfare at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Kwajalein, and now sought to apply them on a massive scale. The invasion of Saipan required nothing less than the largest concentration of naval and ground forces the Pacific theater had yet seen. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Ocean areas, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, leading the Fifth Fleet, marshaled resources with precision. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, troop transports, and oilers all had to be synchronized like pieces on a vast chessboard. More than 535 ships were gathered, stretching the logistical capacity of the U.S. Navy to its limits. This colossal fleet carried nearly 127,000 men, including Marine and Army divisions, along with air and logistical units. It was a floating city, complete with medical facilities, supply lines, and mobile repair bases. The planning also included the newly established service squadrons, which acted as mobile supply depots to sustain the fleet far from Pearl Harbor. Every ship had its assignment, every officer his orders, and every sailor his place in a vast, intricate machine. The invasion force was built around a nucleus of fast carrier task groups, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, whose flat ops represented the cutting edge of American power projection. These carriers, bristling with FEV-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, provided both the offensive punch and the aerial shield necessary to confront Japanese air power. Escort carriers supplemented them, tasked with close support of troops once they hit the beaches. Protecting the carriers was an armored wall of battleships, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, now rebuilt and thirsting for revenge. These mighty dreadnoughts carried 14-inch and 16-inch guns capable of pulverizing shore defenses or smashing Japanese warships. Cruisers formed the backbone of surface fire support, while destroyers acted as both guardians and aggressive hunters of submarines. Submarines, meanwhile, patrolled ahead, intercepting Japanese reinforcements and gathering intelligence. Every category of vessel had a purpose, and the Armada's strength was not merely in numbers, but in its integration into a cohesive, balanced force. The ground forces destined for Saipan were equally formidable and represented a joint service cooperation that had matured since the war's early years. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, both seasoned in Pacific combat, formed the vanguard of the landing. Alongside them, the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division would participate, reinforcing the Marines in a demonstration of combined arms unity. These men were trained in amphibious assault tactics, refined through years of bloody trial and error. Specialized units such as naval construction battalions, the Seabees, would accompany them, tasked with rapidly building airfields, roads, and supply depots once beachheads were secure. Engineers were prepared to clear obstacles, while artillery units were ready to be ferried ashore to provide supporting fire. Amphibious tractors, or LVTs, carried assault troops directly onto beaches, while DUKWs and Higgins boats transported waves of reinforcements. Each division was a self-contained army, equipped not only for combat, but for sustaining prolonged operations in the field. Together, these units formed a combined invasion force of unparalleled strength in the Pacific War up to that time. Logistics, often the overlooked dimension of warfare, stood as the invisible foundation of this operation. Saipan lay more than 3,500 miles from Pearl Harbor, and keeping such a vast fleet supplied was a Herculean task. The U.S. Navy had mastered underway replenishment, a revolutionary system allowing oilers and supply ships to refuel carriers and battleships at sea without returning to port. This innovation meant Spruance's Fifth Fleet could sustain combat operations indefinitely, free from reliance on fixed bases vulnerable to attack. Floating dry docks and repair ships accompanied the Armada, ensuring that damaged vessels could be restored to combat readiness in theater. Cargo ships carried millions of rounds of ammunition, tons of food, medical supplies, and spare aircraft. Even ice cream barges and recreation ships traveled with the fleet, a testament to American industrial abundance. The ability to project such immense force across the Pacific spoke volumes about the U.S. economy's wartime transformation. Without this logistical backbone, the Great Battle for Saipan could not have even been attempted. The scale of the fleet also demanded meticulous command and control, which had evolved dramatically since the chaotic days of early war battles. Admiral Spruance exercised overall command with calm, deliberate precision, while Mitchell directed the fast carriers with aggressive instinct. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the master of amphibious operations, commanded the Joint Expeditionary Force, ensuring the safe delivery of ground troops to the beaches. Communication networks were vast, involving radio relays, coded transmissions, and flag signals that had to function seamlessly amid the confusion of battle. Intelligence officers worked tirelessly, updating commanders on Japanese strength and dispositions, while weather teams predicted conditions that could affect both the landings and naval engagements. The coordination between Navy and Army was especially significant, as past operations had revealed friction between services. At Saipan, these rivalries were carefully managed to ensure unity of effort. Every level of command understood the stakes. The success of the invasion could bring American bombers within striking range of Japan itself. Training for the assault was equally rigorous, involving full-scale rehearsals across Hawaiian waters. Marines and soldiers practiced embarking and debarking from transports, timing their movements with precision to avoid confusion on the beaches. Navy gun crews drilled in shore bombardment techniques, while pilots rehearsed close air support missions. Amphibious tractors tested their ability to climb reef barriers, and demolition teams practiced blasting obstacles. Medical teams drilled evacuation procedures, preparing for the inevitable tide of casualties that would soon fill hospital ships. Coordination exercises between the different services sought to iron out mistakes before the real assault. At times these rehearsals exposed shortcomings, but commanders preferred discovering flaws during training rather than in battle. The men grew increasingly aware that their next landing would not be another small atoll, but a heavily defended island crawling with enemy soldiers. This preparation instilled both confidence and apprehension, for every man knew the cost of assaulting Saipan would be measured in blood. The sailors, marines, and soldiers of the invasion force understood that they were about to participate in a campaign that could shift the balance of the entire Pacific War. For the men aboard the fleet's ships, the journey to Saipan carried with it a mix of excitement and dread. Some saw it as the culmination of years of training and hard service, while others worried about whether they would live to see its end. Letters were written, prayers whispered, and lucky charms kept close at hand. Chaplains gave sermons aboard decks, reminding men of duty and sacrifice. The carrier's flight decks bustled with activity as aircraft were armed, fueled, and inspected for the coming battles. Battleship crews polished brass fittings and ran endless gunnery drills, determined that their salvos would not miss their targets. On transports, Marines sharpened bayonets, checked rifles, and tried to sleep in cramped quarters. Everywhere there was a sense of anticipation so thick it seemed to permeate the sea air itself. By early June 1944, the Armada was ready, a titan of steel and manpower poised to unleash its fury. From the decks of command ships, Spruance, Turner, and Mitcher gazed upon the vast fleet stretching horizon to horizon, each vessel a piece of the great mosaic of war. Never before had such a powerful American force gathered in the Pacific, and its presence symbolized not only military might, but also industrial dominance. This was the embodiment of Roosevelt's promise to bring the fight to Japan, step by step, island by island. The Japanese defenders on Saipan could not have fathomed the scale of what was coming, nor the resources being brought against them. Yet for all its strength, the Armada carried within it the lives of men who would soon be asked to give everything. As the fleet sailed westward, every sailor and soldier felt the weight of history pressing upon them. The invasion of Saipan was not just another operation, it was the threshold to Japan's doorstep. As the US Armada steamed toward Saipan, the defenders of the island, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saitō, had already transformed the rugged volcanic terrain into a fortress of death. Saipan's landscape, marked by jagged cliffs, dense vegetation, and natural caves, offered the Japanese countless opportunities to construct layered defenses invisible from the air. Engineers carved intricate tunnel networks into the limestone ridges, enabling soldiers to move unseen from one strongpoint to another without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Bunkers reinforced with concrete and steel were embedded into hillsides, their gun ports angled to sweep the beaches with overlapping arcs of fire. The shoreline itself was ringed with pillboxes, machine gun nests, and hidden artillery, waiting to ambush the Americans as they landed. Mines and barbed wire were laid thick across the sand to delay advancing troops. Even shallow inland valleys were fortified with interlocking trenches, dugouts, and camouflaged firing positions. The island was, in essence, turned into one vast labyrinth of traps, all designed to inflict maximum casualties. This was not a hasty defense. It was the result of years of preparation. General Saitō knew the Americans would come, and he intended to make Saipan a graveyard for them. The defensive doctrine guiding Saipan's garrison was rooted in Japan's broader philosophy of resistance at all costs. By 1944, Tokyo had abandoned the idea of stopping the Allies at sea. Instead, its commanders aimed to bleed the Americans white on land. Saitō embraced this doctrine fully, preparing his men for a battle where survival was never the goal. Soldiers were instructed that surrender was dishonorable, and death in combat was the only acceptable outcome. They were told that Saipan was not merely a battlefield but sacred soil, an extension of the Japanese homeland, for its loss would expose the very heart of the empire to direct attack. This sense of duty was reinforced through relentless indoctrination, speeches, and the ever-present spirit of Bushido, which glorified sacrifice. The garrison's orders were clear: hold Saipan as long as possible, inflict crippling losses, and die if necessary. It was an uncompromising, even suicidal strategy, but one the men accepted without question. In this mindset, every cave became a castle, every bunker a shrine of resistance. To them, Saipan was not a stepping stone for America. It was the line they could not afford to lose. General Saitō commanded a force of roughly 30,000 men, comprising regular Imperial Japanese Army units, naval troops, and a large contingent of civilian laborers pressed into service. Many of these soldiers were veterans of campaigns in China or earlier island battles, experienced in defensive warfare and deeply hardened by years of conflict. Among them were elite units trained specifically in night infiltration, ambush tactics, and close-quarters fighting. They were supported by tanks, heavy artillery, and mortars strategically hidden across the island. Japanese engineers, skilled in concealment, buried ammunition dumps and food supplies deep within caves, ensuring that the defenders could sustain a long siege even under bombardment. To the Americans, it appeared as though the island was covered only in palm trees and hills, but beneath the surface lay a hidden army, ready to emerge at the worst possible moment. Saito's intelligence officers studied previous American landings in Tarawa and Kwajalein, identifying patterns in U.S. tactics and predicting where the blow would fall. This preparation allowed them to concentrate their defenses on the western beaches, where the invasion was most likely. In this way, Saipan was transformed into a trap meticulously set for the invaders. The physical geography of Saipan was a defender's dream. Its western beaches sloped gently toward coral reefs, forcing attacking amphibious craft to slow and expose themselves to fire. Behind the beaches rose sugarcane fields, open areas where advancing troops would be vulnerable to machine guns positioned in the tree lines and ridges. Further inland, Mount Tapochau, the island's central peak, loomed over the battlefield like a watchtower, offering the Japanese commanding views of nearly the entire island. From these heights, artillery could direct fire on landing zones with devastating accuracy. Northern Saipan was marked by steep cliffs and coral formations that acted as natural fortresses, while the southern areas contained caves perfect for defensive networks. Every terrain feature was exploited to its maximum potential. Where nature did not provide obstacles, the Japanese created them, digging ditches, laying mines, and building barricades. The result was a battlefield where the attacker had no safe avenue of approach. Whether on the beach, in the cane fields, or climbing the ridges, American forces would find themselves under fire from angles they could not see. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized depth over rigidity, and Saipan reflected this perfectly. Instead of concentrating all their strength on the beaches, where they might be annihilated by naval gunfire, Saito's forces withdrew much of their combat power inland. This allowed the first wave of Americans to land, but ensured they would immediately face brutal resistance once they advanced. The intention was psychological as much as tactical: lull the invaders into believing they had secured a foothold, then bleed them in relentless counterattacks and ambushes. To sustain this, Japanese units built fallback positions throughout the island, each connected by tunnels to allow for sudden redeployments. Units could vanish from one sector and reappear where they were least expected. Artillery pieces were placed in caves with sliding doors or camouflaged nets, making them nearly impossible to locate until they fired. The Americans would soon realize they were not fighting for territory in the conventional sense, but against a living, breathing fortress that adapted to every move they made. This strategy of elastic defense was designed to stretch the battle into weeks of attrition. The civilian population of Saipan, over 20,000 men, women and children, was also drawn into the defensive web, either willingly or under coercion. Many were native Chamorros and Carolinians, while others were Japanese settlers who had been living on the island for decades. Japanese authorities armed some civilians, trained them in rudimentary tactics, and encouraged them to resist the Americans. Others were forced into labor, building fortifications, carrying ammunition, and digging trenches under constant threat of punishment. Propaganda spread among them, warning that American soldiers were barbarians who would kill indiscriminately, driving many civilians to accept death over capture. This blurring of lines between soldier and civilian would add a tragic dimension to the coming battle. General Saitō saw the civilian presence not as a liability, but as an additional weapon, complicating American efforts and stretching their resources. In his eyes, Saipan was a total war zone, where every inhabitant, willingly or not, was part of the defense. In preparation for the invasion, Japanese troops rehearsed counterattacks by night and suicide charges meant to overwhelm American beachheads. They stockpiled grenades and explosives, preparing to use them in close quarters assaults. Snipers were trained to exploit Saipan's vegetation, taking shots from trees and concealed holes, then vanishing into the shadows. Engineers planted mines not only on the beaches, but also along expected inland routes, anticipating American tank movements. Naval units contributed suicide boats, small craft laden with explosives, meant to dart out of hidden coves and ram into landing craft or warships. Pilots stationed nearby were prepared for kamikaze-style missions, though this tactic was only just beginning to emerge in the Pacific War. Altogether, these preparations painted a picture of an enemy willing to use every means available, conventional or not, to delay the inevitable. For General Saitō, the goal was never victory in the traditional sense. It was to force the Americans to pay a price so high that their advance toward Japan might be slowed or even halted. When American planners studied aerial reconnaissance of Saipan before the invasion, much of this hidden fortress went unnoticed. The photographs showed open beaches, scattered villages and fields of cane, but they could not reveal the tunnels, caves and camouflaged emplacements lying in wait. Commanders expected resistance, but few grasped the true extent of the defenses awaiting them. They would only understand when the landing craft hit the beaches and the hills erupted in fire. Saipan to the Americans was a strategic prize, but to the Japanese it was sacred ground, a shield for their homeland and a symbol of their resolve. General Saitō's preparations were more than military. They were spiritual, binding his soldiers to the fate of the empire itself. In transforming Saipan into a fortress, he was also transforming it into a stage for one of the Pacific's most brutal confrontations. The island was ready, its defenders were ready, and they were prepared to die to the last man. The only question that remained was how many Americans they would take with them before the end. They were young men, most in their late teens and early 20s, drawn from every corner of the United States, yet united by the khaki and green of their uniforms. Many had grown up in small towns, on farms or in the bustling streets of cities, having never before left their home states, let alone sailed halfway across the Pacific. The Marines were renowned for their toughness, forged in the brutal lessons of Guadalcanal, Tarawa and Kwajalein, where amphibious warfare had been perfected in blood and hardship. The soldiers of the U.S. Army Divisions too were hardened by training camps that pushed them through mud, rifle ranges, and endless marches under the blazing sun. Their rifles were M1 Garands, their packs heavy with rations, ammunition, and gear that could mean survival in the unforgiving terrain of Saipan. Behind every soldier was the weight of their families' prayers, photographs tucked into helmets or wallets, and the letters that reminded them of the world they had left behind. They were volunteers and draftees, bound by duty and circumstance, compelled to fight a war they did not start but were determined to finish. These men carried both courage and fear, a volatile mix that defined the human experience in combat. Many had been drilled to perfection in amphibious landings, rehearsing beach assaults countless times in the Hawaiian Islands before being sent to the front lines. Yet no amount of training could fully prepare them for what lay ahead on Saipan, Japanese soil, within striking distance of Tokyo itself. To them this was not just another island, but the doorstep of the enemy's homeland, a battlefield heavy with symbolic meaning. Training for these Marines and soldiers had been grueling, a relentless series of drills designed to harden mind and body for the ferocity of amphibious warfare. They were taught to disembark landing craft under live fire simulations, to crawl through barbed wire while machine guns rattled overhead, and to coordinate with naval bombardments that shook the ground beneath them. Physical endurance was paramount. Long marches with 60-pound packs under tropical sun, push-ups until arms buckled, and endless hours cleaning rifles until they gleamed with lethal precision. Discipline was instilled at every level, not just as obedience to orders but as survival instinct, for hesitation on the battlefield could mean death for oneself and comrades. Marines were drilled in hand-to-hand combat, bayonet thrusts, and close-quarters fighting in the event Japanese defenders emerged suddenly from caves or bunkers. Army troops, equally well-trained, learned how to establish beachheads, fortify captured positions, and hold against the inevitable counterattacks. The training grounds in Hawaii and California echoed with the cadence of shouted commands, rifle reports, and the thud of grenades detonating in practice ranges. This was the crucible that turned ordinary young Americans into combat veterans before they ever set foot on enemy soil. Yet beneath the polished drills and rehearsed maneuvers lingered a gnawing truth: Saipan would be unlike anything they had faced before. The Japanese defenders had sworn to fight to the last man, and the Americans would be testing their training against one of the most determined foes in history. Psychologically, the weight of Saipan bore down on every soldier and Marine who boarded the transports bound for the Marianas. The island was not just another stepping stone in the island-hopping campaign, it was Japanese territory, inhabited by civilians loyal to the emperor, defended by thousands of dug-in soldiers. Unlike the jungles of the Solomons or the coral atolls of the Marshalls, Saipan felt dangerously close to the Japanese homeland itself, only 1,500 miles from Tokyo. This proximity gave the battle a symbolic gravity. If the Americans succeeded here, they would place Japan directly under the shadow of their long-range bombers. The men knew what this meant: a shift in the entire war, one that might bring the enemy to its knees, but only at tremendous cost. Many grappled with fear in silence, writing home with cheerful words that belied the gnawing dread in their minds. Some turned to prayer, clutching rosaries, Bibles or dog-eared books of scripture. Others masked their nerves with humor, cracking jokes about the Navy's food or the endless boredom of waiting before the storm. Yet, as the Armada drew closer, the enormity of what lay ahead became impossible to ignore. For the first time, America was not just striking at an outpost, but at the very threshold of Japan's empire. Every man knew that the fight for Saipan would not just be a battle of arms, but of willpower and endurance. Among the Marines and soldiers, bonds of brotherhood became the strongest armor against fear. Training had forged not just warriors, but small units of men who trusted each other with their lives. Squad leaders drilled their men to act instinctively together, covering each other's flanks, watching for hidden threats, and never leaving a comrade behind. Friendships formed in barracks, on training grounds and aboard transports, where conversations about home, baseball, or girlfriends helped pass the anxious hours. The men often shared everything: cigarettes, rations, even letters from home, creating a collective resilience that could withstand the chaos of combat. The thought of letting down one's squad or platoon became a stronger motivator than even patriotism or duty. This camaraderie carried them through fear, giving them strength when the chaos of battle threatened to overwhelm. Many veterans would later say that they did not fight for flags or grand strategies, but for the man beside them whose survival depended on their own. In the coming days on Saipan, this bond would be tested to the breaking point, as entire squads were decimated in minutes on beaches raked by fire. Yet it was this human connection that gave the Marines and soldiers a sense of purpose and unity amid the brutality. Brotherhood was their shield, their sanctuary, and in many cases their salvation. Despite their rigorous training and camaraderie, the men faced daunting uncertainties that gnawed at their confidence. The sheer size of the invasion force, tens of thousands of men packed onto ships, created a sense of anonymity, as each individual wondered whether they would survive or vanish unnoticed into the sea of casualties. Rumors spread across the decks, wild speculation about Japanese defenses, suicide charges, and what awaited them in the caves and jungles of Saipan. Veterans of Tarawa and Guadalcanal warned the newcomers about the tenacity of Japanese soldiers, their refusal to surrender, and their willingness to fight until death. Some men lay awake at night, staring at the steel ceilings of their bunks, unable to silence the images of machine guns, grenades, and bayonets that haunted their thoughts. The reality of combat loomed over every whispered conversation and nervous glance. Even as chaplains led prayers and officers delivered stirring speeches, the truth was inescapable: not all of them would return. The psychological strain was as heavy as the packs they carried, pressing down on them with invisible force. In the silence before the battle, the human mind became the greatest battlefield of all. The Marines brought with them a proud legacy, steeped in the bloody lessons of earlier campaigns. They saw themselves as shock troops, hardened by their corps' reputation for ferocity, discipline, and unmatched courage. Many of them carried the memory of Tarawa, where in just 76 hours, nearly 1,000 Marines had been killed, storming a tiny atoll. Those lessons had been seared into their tactics. Greater use of naval bombardment, better coordination with tanks and artillery, and more refined amphibious landing procedures. The soldiers of the army divisions, particularly the 27th Infantry Division, carried their own history of combat in the Pacific, including bitter encounters in the Gilberts. Both branches, though sometimes rivals in pride and reputation, would soon fight shoulder to shoulder against an enemy that respected neither branch nor banner. To the Japanese, they were all invaders to be annihilated, and to the Americans, survival would depend on cooperation, coordination, and shared sacrifice. The traditions of their units, the flags of their divisions, and the memory of fallen comrades gave them strength. Yet, beneath the bravado, every man knew that Saipan was a gamble of unprecedented scale, where history would be written in blood and fire. On board the transports, daily life before the invasion was a strange mixture of routine and tension. Men cleaned their rifles for the 100th time, checked their ammunition pouches, and tightened the straps of their helmets. They played cards, wrote letters, or leaned against the railings to watch the endless ocean, pretending for a moment that nothing awaited them. Some attended makeshift church services, where chaplains spoke of courage, sacrifice, and faith. Their words carried over the sound of waves crashing against steel hulls. Others listened to briefings from officers who unfolded maps of Saipan, pointing to beaches codenamed red, blue, green, and yellow, each a zone where men would live or die in the first minutes of the assault. Navy gunners practiced their drills, while Marines and soldiers rehearsed climbing down cargo nets into landing craft. The smell of salt and oil filled the air, mingling with the nervous sweat of men who tried to laugh off their fear. At night the decks were quiet, broken only by the hum of engines and the murmurs of conversations too heavy for daylight. Each passing hour brought them closer to the island, closer to the unknown. As Saipan loomed just beyond the horizon, the men of the invasion force stood at the threshold of destiny. They were not seasoned generals or architects of grand strategy, but ordinary Americans thrust into the crucible of history. Their youth would collide with the merciless reality of war, their training tested against an enemy determined to die rather than surrender. They carried on their shoulders not just rifles and gear, but the weight of a nation's hopes, the belief that each step forward brought the war closer to its end. For many, Saipan would be the place where their lives ended, their stories cut short on the beaches or in the jungles. For others, it would become the defining chapter of their existence, a memory that haunted them long after the guns fell silent. Together, they represented the flesh and blood of America's war effort, the human element behind statistics and strategies. Their courage, their fear, their brotherhood, and their sacrifice would shape the outcome of Saipan. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon on the day of the invasion, they were no longer merely soldiers and marines. They were the embodiment of a nation's resolve. And in the days ahead, their actions would echo across the Pacific and into history itself. On the morning of June 13th, 1944, the waters off Saipan shimmered with the steel might of the United States Navy. Arrayed before the island was an armada, unlike anything the Pacific had seen to that point, a fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poised to rain destruction on Japanese defenses. At the heart of this operation were 7 battleships, veterans of Pearl Harbor and newer additions to the fleet, each bristling with 14 and 16-inch guns capable of leveling fortifications. Alongside them steamed 11 cruisers, their rapid-firing 8-inch and 6-inch batteries prepared to sweep the beaches and cliffs. Nearly 24 destroyers ringed the formation, tasked with closing to dangerous ranges to pour shells directly into caves, gun pits, and hidden bunkers. The order was simple but absolute: devastate Saipan's defenses and make the landings possible. The island was about to endure one of the heaviest naval bombardments of the entire Pacific War, a storm of steel and fire designed to crush any resistance. For the Japanese defenders hidden within Saipan's rugged landscape, the sound of the approaching barrage must have been apocalyptic. American spotter planes circled overhead, dropping flares and smoke markers to designate targets, while forward observers prepared to direct the battleship's fire with uncanny precision. The opening salvo came like thunder, great plumes of water and earth exploding as massive shells ripped into the coastline. Trees were blown apart like matchsticks, and coral cliffs shattered under the relentless hammering. The shockwaves could be felt miles inland, rattling every cave and bunker where Japanese soldiers huddled in anticipation. Yet beneath the fury, General Yoshitsugu Saito's men gritted their teeth, convinced that survival in their deep tunnels and fortifications would allow them to endure the storm. The Americans were intent on destruction, but the Japanese were just as determined to withstand it, creating a collision of wills as terrifying as the physical destruction itself. The bombardment unfolded with a methodical rhythm, a deadly orchestra conducted by Admiral Raymond Spruance's fleet. Battleships fired in slow, thunderous cadence, each round weighing nearly a ton, arcing through the sky before crashing into the island with devastating force. Cruisers supplemented the fire with rapid, successive blasts that churned the beaches into moonscapes. Destroyers darted forward dangerously close to the shore, their smaller caliber guns stitching the coastline with torrents of steel. Every known gun emplacement, radar station, and suspected troop concentration was targeted, with shells pounding the same areas until nothing seemed left standing. Naval gunners took grim satisfaction in reducing bunkers to rubble, though the dense terrain often concealed how much damage had truly been inflicted. Above it all, aircraft from nearby carriers swept overhead, strafing with machine guns and dropping bombs, merging sea power and air power into a single overwhelming onslaught. From the perspective of the American crews, the bombardment was both awe-inspiring and exhausting. Men at the big guns labored in teams, sweating under the tropical sun as they hauled powder bags and shells into breaches. Each shot shook the decks, ringing in the ears and vibrating through the steel hulls of the ships. Spotters called corrections through crackling radios, and commanders adjusted fire with mathematical precision, determined not to waste a single shell. Sailors crowded railings when off duty, staring at the towering columns of smoke and flame rising from Saipan like volcanoes erupting from the earth. The ocean, calm and blue beyond the gun lines, contrasted with the inferno of the island, where entire ridgelines disappeared in clouds of dust and fire. To many Americans, it looked like no living thing could survive. But seasoned veterans knew better. The Japanese were experts at enduring beneath the ground. The terrain of Saipan made the bombardment both effective and limited. The island was rugged, with sharp cliffs, volcanic ridges, and dense vegetation that shielded Japanese positions from direct observation. American gunners often blasted one ridge endlessly, only to discover later that defenders had shifted into deeper caves beyond the reach of even the heaviest shells. Still, the devastation to surface defenses was undeniable. Coastal guns meant to repel the invasion were shattered, pillboxes obliterated, and entire sections of jungle burned away. Ammunition dumps ignited, sending secondary explosions echoing through the hills. Yet in the hidden depths, General Saitō's men remained largely intact, grimly awaiting the assault they knew must come. The bombardment's greatest effect was psychological, convincing Japanese soldiers that the Americans possessed a seemingly inexhaustible arsenal and unrelenting determination. For 3 days, the naval bombardment continued in waves, shifting from heavy saturation to precise targeting of specific strongholds. Destroyers risked counterfire by steaming so close to shore that Japanese artillery could occasionally strike back, though most of the defenders' guns were silenced or buried under rubble. One destroyer, USS Pennsylvania, came under accurate return fire and retaliated with brutal force, hammering the source until silence returned. Naval aviators provided aerial reconnaissance between bombardments, photographing damage and relaying information on where resistance still remained. Fires raged across Saipan, filling the air with choking smoke that drifted out over the sea, clinging to ships and staining the sky. The devastation was so thorough that some commanders feared the island would be unrecognizable to Marines set to land on its shores. On June 15th, the bombardment reached its crescendo, the final preparatory strike before American Marines and soldiers would storm the beaches. Battleships lined up broadside and unleashed full salvos, their gun barrels spitting fire and smoke in unison. The sea quaked from the recoil, and the island groaned under the impacts, as if nature itself were rebelling against the storm of steel. Communication cables were shredded, command posts obliterated, and defensive trenches filled with debris. To the Americans, it was a calculated destruction meant to pave the way for landing craft and amphibious tractors. To the Japanese, it was a test of their will, a reminder that survival alone was now an act of defiance. Beneath shattered ridges and collapsed bunkers, Saitō's soldiers clutched rifles, grenades, and swords, determined to rise when the invaders finally appeared. When the thunder finally faded, Saipan was scarred and smoldering, yet far from conquered. The bombardment had expended thousands of shells, an arsenal so vast it surpassed many campaigns in Europe. American confidence swelled. The crews of the fleet believed they had broken the back of Japanese resistance, but the defenders were not broken. They had endured in their labyrinth of caves, their casualties far fewer than the devastation suggested. For the Marines and soldiers preparing to land, this meant that the worst still lay ahead. The bombardment had been a storm before the storm, a necessary act of devastation, but not a guarantee of victory. Saipan still bristled with hidden firepower and a determined enemy waiting for the moment when American boots hit the sand. June 15th, 1944, dawned with a deceptive calm over the seas off Saipan. The horizon was dotted with the silhouettes of battleships, carriers, cruisers, and transports, their steel hulls glistening in the morning light as thousands of men prepared for the longest day of their lives. At precisely 5:42 a.m., naval guns once again opened fire, unleashing thunder that shook the island to its core and blanketed the beaches in choking dust and smoke. The bombardment sought to weaken Japanese defenses, but hidden caves and reinforced bunkers absorbed much of the impact. Marines and Army infantry packed into landing craft, waiting anxiously as the call to move forward echoed over the waves. Many whispered quiet prayers, while others clutched good luck charms, their eyes fixed on the smoke-shrouded shoreline. Officers barked orders, reminding the men of their training, yet nothing could truly prepare them for what awaited. Waves of amphibious tractors, or Amtraks, began forming up in the choppy seas, engines roaring against the spray. Navy aircraft swooped low, strafing suspected Japanese positions and dropping bombs to suppress fire. The men aboard the landing craft were struck by the contrast. Above them, the sky was a dazzling blue, but before them the island promised only death. It was the beginning of D-Day on Saipan. At 8:44 a.m., the first wave of Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions surged toward the island. The Amtraks, designed to crawl over coral reefs, struggled in the heavy surf as Japanese artillery began to zero in on their formations. Shells whistled overhead, splashing into the sea, sending geysers of water crashing back down onto men already drenched in sweat and salt. Some craft were hit directly, bursting into flames and spilling their human cargo into the water. Survivors struggled to swim in the tide, weighed down by gear and weapons, while comrades tried desperately to pull them aboard. Japanese mortars and machine guns opened up as the first vehicles reached the reef line, turning the turquoise shallows into a killing field. Marines leapt from their Amtraks, slogging through waist-deep water, every step feeling like miles under withering fire. The air was filled with the acrid stench of cordite and the screams of the wounded, mingling with the relentless hammer of Japanese guns. Officers waved men forward, urging them to keep moving, knowing hesitation meant certain death. The beaches of Saipan had become a crucible where courage and chaos clashed in brutal fashion. The Japanese defenders had been waiting for this moment, and their fire was devastatingly accurate. General Yoshitsugu Saito's forces had carefully sighted artillery pieces on the beaches, creating kill zones where Marines would be trapped under intersecting fire. Heavy guns hidden in caves and pillboxes poured streams of fire into the surf, mowing down men as they waded ashore. Mortars rained down on concentrations of landing craft, churning the waters with deadly shrapnel. Japanese machine gunners waited until Marines were exposed before opening up with short, brutal bursts. On the reefs, bodies floated alongside wrecked equipment, grim markers of the cost of advancing a few yards. Some Amtraks managed to crawl ashore, but they quickly became targets for anti-tank guns and were blasted apart in fireballs. Men who made it to the sand clawed for cover in shallow craters, trying to orient themselves amidst the carnage. The cries for corpsmen rose above the din, as medics risked everything to treat the wounded in the open. It was war at its most savage, where survival hinged on instinct and the ability to keep moving under impossible odds. By mid-morning, the beaches of Saipan were scenes of unimaginable horror. The fine white sand was churned into a grotesque mixture of blood, debris, and shattered bodies. Landing waves kept coming, piling men onto beaches that were little more than open-air killing grounds. Marines crouched behind destroyed vehicles, using them as shields as they returned fire against barely visible Japanese positions. The naval guns offshore tried to assist, but many Japanese bunkers were invisible beneath layers of coral and rock. Engineers struggled to clear obstacles while under fire, their charges detonating with deafening blasts as they attempted to carve paths inland. Smoke drifted in thick clouds across the water, obscuring friend and foe alike. Still, discipline held. Small squads of Marines began inching forward, hugging the ground, crawling from one depression to the next. Their rifles and flamethrowers cracked and roared in response, silencing enemy nests one by one. The first beachheads were forming, but at a cost so steep it shocked even the most hardened veterans. The Army's 27th Infantry Division, landing on the beaches between the two Marine divisions, faced equally punishing resistance. Their landing zone was a narrow strip of beach overlooked by cliffs and fortified positions, where Japanese defenders unleashed torrents of fire. Men spilled out of landing craft into a maelstrom, diving for the ground as bullets snapped overhead. Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in yards rather than miles, and every advance left a trail of casualties. Tanks began to land to support the infantry, but many bogged down in the soft sand or were destroyed by well-placed artillery. Infantrymen used grenades and satchel charges to root out stubborn bunkers, often engaging in close-quarters combat where hesitation meant death. The division's progress was uneven, with some units pinned down while others clawed forward at great cost. Commanders pleaded for naval gunfire support, but coordinating strikes so close to their own troops was fraught with danger. The Army and Marine units were beginning to link up, but the Japanese defense had already shown its ferocity. The beaches of Saipan had become a test of willpower as much as firepower. Throughout the day, the struggle for the beaches intensified as more waves of troops landed. By noon, the shoreline was clogged with wrecked vehicles, supplies, and the wounded awaiting evacuation. Navy corpsmen worked frantically, dragging the injured to safety under constant fire, their bravery earning them legendary status among the men. LSTs landing ship, tank disgorged vehicles and artillery pieces, but many were destroyed before they could even be used. Officers rallied their men again and again, shouting encouragement as they pushed inland inch by inch. The heat grew oppressive, compounding exhaustion and fear as the tropical sun beat down on men already drained by combat. Ammunition ran low in places, forcing Marines to scavenge from the fallen. Japanese counterattacks erupted sporadically as defenders tried to drive the Americans back into the sea. Each was repelled with brutal determination, leaving the sand littered with bodies. Slowly, painfully, a tenuous line of control began to emerge on Saipan's western shore. By the late afternoon of June 15th, a fragile foothold had been established. The Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions had secured a narrow strip of beach, though at staggering cost. The Army's 27th Division, though bloodied, had managed to hold its ground and connect with Marine units. Naval gunfire continued to pound inland positions, while engineers cleared lanes for tanks and artillery to move forward. Still, Japanese resistance showed no sign of collapse. Instead, they regrouped for further attacks. Men dug into the sand, fortifying whatever ground they held, knowing the night would bring more danger. Corpses lay everywhere, reminders of the price of each step forward. Commanders ashore reported back grim casualty figures, while fleet commanders offshore pressed for more reinforcements to ensure the beachhead could survive. Supplies trickled in through the chaos, providing desperately needed ammunition, food, and water. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the exhausted Americans braced for the next phase of the battle. Nightfall on June 15th brought no respite to the men on Saipan. The Japanese launched furious counterattacks under cover of darkness, their screams of Banzai piercing the humid night air. Flares illuminated the beaches in eerie flashes as firefights erupted across the sand. Marines and soldiers clung to their shallow foxholes, firing into shadows that suddenly surged into view. Naval guns and destroyers close to shore fired star shells, bathing the battlefield in a ghostly glow and pounding advancing Japanese units with devastating shells. The clash was savage, with bayonets and grenades deciding life and death at arm's length. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the Americans held firm, their beachhead blood-soaked yet unbroken. Exhausted, filthy, and haunted by what they had endured, the survivors watched the dawn creep over Saipan on June 16th. They had come through the fire, but the battle was only beginning. The island awaited, and with it the next deadly chapter in the Pacific War. As dawn broke on June 16, 1944, the beaches of Saipan were still soaked with blood and chaos, yet the Marines and Army soldiers knew their mission was only beginning. Establishing a beachhead was not merely about surviving the first waves of fire, but about carving out a foothold strong enough to repel counterattacks and push inland. The Japanese defenders had not been destroyed by the naval bombardment or the initial landings. They had only been shaken, and now they prepared to strike back with desperate fury. Charan, Kanoa, the largest village near the landing zones, became the focal point of both sides, as it held key roads that led directly into the island's interior. Without seizing this area, the Americans risked being bottled up on the sand with no room to maneuver or bring in reinforcements. The night before, soldiers dug foxholes in the sand, stacking sandbags and salvaging wreckage for cover, aware that the darkness was alive with movement. Japanese infiltrators crept through the tall grasses, hurling grenades into positions and sniping at silhouettes under the moonlight. By sunrise, the Americans were exhausted but grimly determined, their lines holding against constant probes. This was no longer just about landing, it was about survival and expansion. General Yoshitsugu Saitō had devised a ruthless plan. Instead of defending the beaches passively, he would strike hard and fast to push the invaders back into the sea. Waves of Japanese infantry, supported by tanks, artillery and mortars, surged toward the fragile American beachhead. For many Marines and soldiers, this was the first time they faced Japanese tanks head-on, as Type 97 Chiha mediums rumbled forward across the open ground. The scene was apocalyptic, armor belching fire, infantry charging with bayonets fixed, and the roar of artillery shells exploding in the surf. American bazooka teams scrambled into action, their rockets streaking into the thin armor of Japanese tanks, often setting them ablaze in spectacular fireballs. Sherman tanks, brought ashore at enormous risk, joined the fray, their 75 mm guns dueling point-blank with Japanese armor. The counterattack, ferocious and coordinated, threatened to break through, but the Americans dug in, using machine guns, mortars, and sheer determination to hold their ground. After hours of brutal fighting, the assault faltered, leaving wrecked tanks smoldering across the sand. For the Japanese, it was a costly gamble. For the Americans, it was proof that their foothold would not be easily erased. But, the battle for Charan Kanoa itself unfolded with brutal intensity, as Marines pushed inland through streets and palm groves turned into killing grounds. Japanese snipers hidden in attics, treetops, and concealed pits fired relentlessly, forcing Americans to clear buildings room by room. Mortars rained down on open areas, making every crossing a deadly gamble. Civilians caught in the middle added to the confusion, some fleeing, some hiding, and others tragically cut down in the crossfire. The Americans fought with methodical precision, flamethrower teams flushing out entrenched defenders in caves and bunkers, while engineers blasted obstacles to clear paths for tanks. Each block taken in Charan Kanoa was paid for with blood, but slowly the Americans tightened their grip on the town. By midday, the stars and stripes flew over its center, though Japanese resistance continued in scattered pockets. The capture of Charan Kanoa was a turning point, providing staging ground for supplies and a base for inland operations. Yet even in victory, the smell of death and the cries of the wounded haunted the men. It was a grim reminder the fight for the beachhead was far from over. As the Americans consolidated their positions, the Japanese launched relentless night counterattacks, hoping to exploit darkness and confusion. Screaming soldiers charged with bayonets and grenades, crashing into foxholes and trench lines with savage ferocity. The hand-to-hand combat was unlike anything many Americans had ever imagined, brutal, intimate, and terrifying. Knives, rifle butts, and even entrenching tools became weapons in the chaos of the night. Flares lit up the battlefield in eerie flashes, illuminating figures locked in desperate struggle before plunging the world back into darkness. Machine guns cut swaths through charging attackers, but still they came, often fighting until the last breath. By dawn the Americans held their lines, but the toll was staggering, with bodies littering the approaches to the beachhead. The psychological strain on the soldiers and Marines was immense, as they learned the Japanese were not simply defending ground but embracing annihilation. Each night's attack reinforced the grim truth: there would be no easy victory on Saipan. The battle for the beachhead had become a crucible of endurance, testing both sides to their limits. The terrain itself added to the ferocity of the struggle, as the beaches gave way to cane fields, swamps, and coral ridges. Each offered natural cover for Japanese ambushes and strongpoints, forcing the Americans to advance cautiously. The heat was oppressive, sapping strength and soaking uniforms with sweat, while the stench of rotting bodies filled the air. Marines advanced in short bursts, hugging the ground as bullets cracked overhead and mortars churned the soil around them. Tanks and armored bulldozers carved paths through the cane fields, often drawing heavy fire that exposed hidden Japanese positions. Engineers worked frantically to repair roads and unload supplies, knowing that without steady logistics, the beachhead would collapse. Casualty evacuation became a nightmare, with corpsmen dragging the wounded across open ground under fire. Despite the hazards, the beachhead grew stronger with each passing day, reinforced by new waves of troops and equipment. By the third day, landing zones were buzzing with activity, resembling a vast machine of war grinding relentlessly forward. The struggle for the beachhead was brutal, but it was also a battle of momentum, and the Americans were beginning to gain it. For the Japanese, the defense of Saipan was a matter of honor and national survival, and they threw every available resource into breaking the beachhead. Artillery hidden in caves and ravines unleashed devastating barrages, often zeroed in with deadly precision. Kamikaze-style infiltration teams slipped through lines at night, planting satchel charges on tanks or detonating themselves among clusters of soldiers. Even wounded soldiers sometimes feigned death, only to rise suddenly with grenades in hand. American commanders understood that they faced not just a military defense, but a cultural ethos that demanded total resistance. Morale on the Japanese side was paradoxically high, despite mounting losses, fueled by propaganda that promised glory in death. On the American side, resilience came from training, discipline, and the grim determination to avenge Pearl Harbor and every bloody battle since. Each clash on the beachhead revealed the collision of two worlds, one bent on survival, the other on annihilation. The Americans began to adapt, using coordinated firepower, combined arms, and overwhelming logistics to wear down the defenders. The beachhead was no longer fragile, it was transforming into a launch pad for conquest. WWII. By June 18th, the Americans controlled a secure zone stretching inland, though pockets of resistance still plagued their progress. Charan Kanoa was firmly under their control, and engineers quickly began converting it into a hub for supply dumps, command posts, and medical stations. Airstrips were already being planned on the flat terrain nearby, proof of how swiftly the Americans sought to transform captured ground into strategic assets. The beachhead now resembled a sprawling war machine, with trucks, tanks, and endless streams of supplies pouring ashore. Soldiers rotated in and out of the front lines, catching brief moments of rest before returning to the hell of battle. Yet, even in these moments, the thunder of artillery and the crack of rifles never ceased. Japanese holdouts still fought in caves and cane fields, and every advance required brutal clearing operations. Civilians emerged in growing numbers, dazed and terrified, complicating the battlefield with their presence. Despite these challenges, the sense of inevitability was growing among American forces. Saipan was theirs to take, though the cost would be immense. The beachhead had been secured, but the island itself remained a fortress that had to be conquered. The struggle for the beachhead set the tone for the rest of the Battle of Saipan, encapsulating the brutal character of the Pacific War. It was a fight where no quarter was given and none expected, where technology and industrial might clashed with fanaticism and defiance. The Americans had proven their ability to endure savage counterattacks, adapt to hostile terrain, and transform chaos into momentum. The Japanese had demonstrated their determination to fight to the last man, launching counterattacks that rivaled anything seen in the Pacific. Charan Kanoa, once a quiet coastal settlement, was now etched in history as the site where the fate of Saipan was sealed. The beachhead, once precarious, was now the foundation for a campaign that would push deeper into the island's heart. For the soldiers who survived those days, the memories would never fade, the screams in the night, the firestorms of artillery, the sight of comrades falling beside them. For the commanders, the beachhead symbolized both triumph and the heavy cost of victory. The Battle of Saipan was still in its opening act, and the bloodiest chapters had yet to be written. But the struggle for the beachhead ensured that the Americans would not be turned back. When the Marines and soldiers pushed beyond the blood-soaked beaches of Saipan, they entered an entirely different world of combat, one that contrasted the open surf with the claustrophobic density of cane fields and jungle growth. The American advance slowed to a crawl, as columns of infantry found themselves hemmed in by towering stalks of sugarcane, which obscured visibility and provided the Japanese with perfect ambush positions. Each step forward carried the risk of a concealed sniper's bullet, a sudden mortar blast, or a well-camouflaged machine gun nest. The villages scattered across the interior were often fortified into small fortresses, where every hut, well, or stone wall became a potential stronghold for defenders. The Americans were forced to move deliberately, sweeping each cluster of buildings with grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonet charges before declaring them secure. What made this fighting uniquely brutal was the blending of natural cover with human-made defenses, leaving U.S. troops unsure whether they were advancing through farmland or stumbling into a battlefield trap. Engineers accompanied infantry squads, searching for hidden bunkers or caves, while clearing paths for tanks and supply vehicles. Yet every advance was costly, as Japanese artillery observers on the higher ridges relayed American positions back to well-placed guns. By the second day inland, the Americans realized that capturing Saipan's interior would be a grinding battle of attrition. The sugarcane fields were deceptive, their beauty masking a deadly environment where combat dissolved into chaos at close quarters. Japanese defenders had meticulously prepared kill zones within the cane rows, ensuring that advancing Marines would face crossfire from positions invisible until the first muzzle flash. The dense vegetation muffled sound, meaning soldiers often stumbled upon the enemy at a distance of only a few feet. To counter this, the Americans resorted to flamethrowers and satchel charges, turning green stalks into charred wastelands, littered with the aftermath of battle. Civilians, too, were tragically caught within these cane fields, with terrified families hiding in ditches or abandoned huts, only to be caught in the crossfire. The presence of non-combatants complicated the U.S. advance, as soldiers grappled with the split-second decisions of distinguishing enemy fighters from civilians. The terrain favored ambushes, forcing officers to keep their units tightly coordinated, lest they be swallowed by the green expanse. Communication lines often broke down, with radios struggling to transmit through thick cover and terrain. This meant that platoon leaders sometimes made isolated decisions with little awareness of the broader battle. The sugarcane fighting stretched nerves thin, introducing a psychological strain as Marines realized that danger lurked in every rustling stalk. Armor became an essential asset, as the US advanced into the open clearings and through the villages. Yet even tanks struggled in Saipan's treacherous terrain. Japanese defenders had anticipated their arrival and emplaced anti-tank guns in concealed ridges, waiting patiently for Sherman's and Stuart light tanks to silhouette themselves against the fields. Mines dotted the paths, and hidden charges detonated beneath treads, immobilizing steel behemoths and turning them into burning wrecks. Yet when tanks did succeed in maneuvering into villages, they proved devastating, crushing barricades and spraying heavy machine gun fire into defensive positions. Infantry quickly learned to advance in coordination with armor, hugging close to the vehicles for protection against snipers. But this cooperation was a double-edged sword, as Japanese gunners often targeted tanks deliberately, hoping to kill or wound the clustered infantry with one catastrophic hit. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear obstacles, filling in anti-tank ditches and demolishing barriers that slowed the armored advance. It became a grim contest between American ingenuity and Japanese resilience, where each village captured was won only after painstaking combined arms assaults. The scars of tank battles could be seen across Saipan's villages, where shattered hulks of both American and Japanese vehicles littered the roadsides. The ridges that loomed over the fields and villages presented perhaps the greatest challenge of all, as they provided the Japanese with commanding views and interlocking fields of fire. General Saitō's forces had transformed Saipan's natural ridges into fortresses, honeycombed with caves and reinforced with concrete positions invisible from the air. Every ridgeline was defended in depth, with multiple fallback positions, ensuring that even if the Americans broke through, resistance would not collapse. The cost of taking each ridge was staggering, as artillery fire rained down upon climbing infantry, who had to contend with steep, rocky slopes under constant fire. Mortars positioned to drop shells directly onto advancing troops proved especially deadly. The Marines resorted to calling in naval gunfire and carrier-based strikes to soften the defenses, but the Japanese often emerged from the rubble seemingly untouched. The ridges were also psychological battlegrounds, as soldiers described the eerie sensation of fighting an enemy that disappeared into the earth, only to reappear behind or above them. The slow grind up these fortified heights demanded immense courage and discipline, as platoons moved inch by inch against a determined foe. Victory was measured not in miles gained, but in individual caves destroyed and ridgelines secured. Artillery duels defined the struggle in the interior, as Japanese guns hidden in natural caves poured fire onto American positions with surprising accuracy. Using pre-registered coordinates, they unleashed sudden bombardments that pinned US troops and disrupted supply lines. Counter-battery fire was difficult, as the enemy pieces disappeared into cavernous hideouts, shielded by layers of rock. American forward observers risked their lives crawling into exposed areas to spot muzzle flashes, guiding naval and field artillery in attempts to silence the guns. Even then, many batteries had multiple firing ports, allowing them to shift fire unpredictably. The soundscape of Saipan's interior became a constant roar of artillery exchanges, punctuated by the rattle of machine guns and the roar of tanks. The Japanese used this advantage not only to inflict casualties, but also to stall American momentum, forcing commanders to reconsider their tempo of advance. For the soldiers in the fields, each barrage felt like an eternity, with men clinging to the earth as shells ripped through cane and soil. Yet slowly, methodically, American firepower began to tip the balance, as the combined might of battleships offshore and artillery ashore reduced defensive strongholds one by one. Civilians once more became unwilling participants in the savage fighting, particularly as battles engulfed villages. Many Chamorro and Japanese settlers were trapped between opposing lines, their homes shattered by artillery and their lives torn apart by the relentless combat. Soldiers recounted finding families huddled in caves, desperate for food and water, fearful of both American troops and Japanese retribution. The Imperial Army often forced civilians into labor or used them as human shields, complicating US operations and leading to tragic losses. American medics and chaplains did their best to offer aid when possible, but in the chaos of the battlefield, humanitarian efforts were secondary to survival. The presence of civilians gave the battle an added layer of sorrow, reminding troops that their struggle unfolded not just against enemy soldiers, but in the midst of human suffering. Civilians' cries often echoed through the villages, mingling with the sounds of battle in haunting ways. These experiences left deep impressions on the Americans, many of whom had never before seen the devastation of war up close among non-combatants. For Japanese civilians on Saipan, the battle was a nightmare that blurred the line between front lines and home front. Their plight highlighted the all-encompassing destruction unleashed by modern war. As the Americans fought deeper into the island, fatigue became an invisible adversary. Days of relentless combat under a scorching tropical sun left soldiers dehydrated, hungry and physically exhausted. Supplies often lagged behind, with ammunition and rations struggling to keep pace with the forward lines. Units slept little, often grabbing rest in shallow foxholes while artillery thundered around them. The psychological toll mounted as well, with constant exposure to ambushes and civilian tragedies weighing heavily on morale. For many young Marines, this was their first sustained ground combat against a dug-in enemy, determined to fight to the last man. Veterans of Tarawa and Kwajalein recognized the familiar patterns, but even they admitted that Saipan's interior presented a more brutal test. Commanders urged their men onward, reminding them of the strategic importance of Saipan's capture, yet in the heat of battle, lofty goals often faded before the immediate challenge of surviving the next day. War in the interior was not a clean sweep, but a slog of attrition that demanded everything from those who fought it. By the end of the first week inland, the Americans had paid dearly for every ridge, field, and village taken, yet their steady advance showed the overwhelming power of coordinated arms. The Japanese fought with unmatched tenacity, but their reliance on static defenses was gradually eroded by the Americans' ability to adapt, combining armor, infantry, artillery, and naval fire into a crushing force. Each day's battles left the interior scarred, transforming lush cane fields into burned landscapes and villages into rubble-strewn shells. Yet victory was not in sight. Every new ridge revealed another fortified line, every field another killing ground. Saipan's heartland became a place where courage was tested relentlessly, where the enemy's refusal to yield turned combat into a nightmare of constant struggle. For the Americans, this was the crucible of the campaign, the true test of their endurance and discipline beyond the initial beachhead. The fight into the interior was not only about seizing ground, but about breaking an enemy's will that had been hardened to the point of fanaticism. And though the price was high, step by bloody step, the Americans pushed deeper into Saipan, setting the stage for the climactic battles that awaited on the island's northern heights. In the very heart of Saipan loomed Mount Tapochau, a rugged peak rising nearly 1,500 feet above sea level, the highest point on the island. From its summit, one could command an unobstructed view of almost the entire battlefield, from the western beaches where the Americans had landed to the eastern cliffs that dropped into the Pacific. For the Japanese defenders, Tapochau was a natural fortress, a watchtower that allowed them to track every American move. For the Americans, capturing it was not simply a matter of prestige, but of survival. Artillery and mortar fire directed from its slopes was devastating the advancing Marines and Army units. The mountain's dense vegetation, jagged rocks, and steep inclines made it nearly impregnable to frontal assault. Japanese troops had fortified the ridges with interlocking bunkers, concealed caves, and carefully sighted machine guns that created overlapping fields of fire. Every movement at its base could be seen, targeted, and punished. The looming silhouette of Tapochau dominated the minds of every man in the line, both as a physical obstacle and as a psychological barrier. It was not just high ground, it was the key to breaking the spine of Japanese defense on Saipan. The assault on Mount Tapochau was not a single battle, but a grueling campaign that unfolded in stages, each step paid for in blood. Units of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division bore the brunt of the initial attempts to climb its steep approaches. The soldiers had to fight through thick sugarcane fields at the base, where Japanese snipers and machine gunners waited in concealed spider holes. Mortar rounds rained down constantly, turning every advance into a crawl. Even when American tanks tried to provide support, the rough terrain prevented them from moving far, and Japanese artillery hidden in caves made short work of any vehicle that attempted to climb. Men scaled cliffs with ropes, only to be met with grenades and gunfire from above. Casualties mounted quickly, and small units often became disorganized in the jungle-like terrain, struggling to maintain communication with higher command. Yet, despite the losses, there was no alternative. The mountain had to be taken, no matter the cost. The Japanese defenders, under General Yoshitsugu Saitō, knew the importance of Tapochau and had turned it into a fortress. They dug extensive tunnel systems into the limestone rock, creating firing ports that were nearly invisible until they spat deadly bullets or shells. Some of these tunnels linked to hidden chambers, stocked with food, ammunition, and medical supplies, allowing the defenders to withstand days of bombardment without surfacing. The Japanese soldiers occupying these positions were veterans of earlier campaigns, hardened by years of jungle warfare, and fiercely committed to the doctrine of fighting to the last man. They used the mountain's natural features with genius-level cunning, concealing artillery pieces in caves and rolling them out, only long enough to fire before dragging them back under cover. Each American step upward was met with flanking fire from multiple directions, leaving attackers unsure where the next shot would come from. In effect, Tapochau was less a mountain and more a fortress city, alive with hidden defenders who seemed impossible to dislodge. American artillery and naval gunfire tried to soften the mountain before infantry assaults, but the results were frustratingly limited. Battleships and cruisers off the coast shelled the slopes with massive 14-inch 16-inch shells, while field artillery from the Beachhead lobbed thousands of rounds at suspected Japanese positions. Explosions thundered across the island, sending up plumes of smoke and dust that temporarily obscured the mountain's ridges. But when the infantry advanced, they found many bunkers still intact, the defenders emerging from underground shelters the moment the shelling ceased. Flamethrower teams were brought forward to flush out caves, but the narrow approaches and withering fire made it nearly impossible to get close enough. Engineers tried using satchel charges to collapse openings, only to be driven back again and again. The realization set in, this was not going to be a quick operation. Mount Tapochau was going to require a prolonged bloody fight, fought yard by yard, ridge by ridge. One of the most intense phases of the battle came as American soldiers attempted to seize the lower ridges that ringed Tapochau. These ridges, though far below the summit, were critical stepping stones toward the peak. Japanese forces used these outlying positions as forward defenses, pouring fire into any American movement. The Americans responded with small unit tactics, squads moving by bounds while machine guns laid down suppressive fire. The fighting quickly devolved into brutal close-quarters engagements. Grenades were exchanged at such short distances that men could hear the shouted commands of their enemies. Bayonet charges surged through narrow trails, the outcome often decided by sheer willpower and speed. In this grinding contest, no advantage was permanent. Positions were captured, lost and recaptured multiple times over the course of hours. The ridges became scarred with shell craters, shattered trees, and the remains of broken units who had paid the price of progress in blood. As the Americans pushed higher, the terrain itself became an enemy. The slopes grew steeper, the rocks sharper, and the vegetation denser. Soldiers carried heavy packs of ammunition, food and water, but the climb left them drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Rainstorms occasionally swept across the mountain, turning the paths into slippery mudslides that made progress nearly impossible. At night, the Japanese launched small-scale infiltration attacks, slipping behind American lines to sow confusion. These raids often ended in savage hand-to-hand combat, with knives, bayonets, and even fists used in the darkness. Exhaustion weighed heavily on the attackers, many of whom had been fighting without rest for days. Yet the knowledge that their comrades on the beaches below were depending on them drove them onward. To control Tapochau was to protect the entire American foothold on Saipan, and that knowledge gave weary men the strength to climb again the next day. The final push to the summit of Mount Tapochau came after days of incremental progress and unrelenting casualties. Coordinated attacks by the 27th Infantry Division and supporting Marine units converged on the upper slopes. The Americans employed everything they could muster: rifles, mortars, machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades to root out the last defenders. By now, many Japanese troops were starving, short on ammunition, and wounded, yet they continued to fight with suicidal ferocity. Some staged last stands in caves, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Others leapt from cliffs rather than be captured, a grim preview of the tragedy that would later unfold on Saipan's northern cliffs. Finally, battered American squads clawed their way to the crest. From the summit, exhausted soldiers gazed across the island, the view stretching from one coastline to the other. It was a moment of triumph, but also of sobering reflection. The peak had been bought with terrible sacrifice. This tanks do things too. The capture of Mount Tapochau marked a turning point in the Battle of Saipan. With the high ground secured, the Japanese defenders lost their ability to direct effective artillery fire across the island. American commanders now possessed an observation point that gave them control over the battlefield, allowing more precise coordination of airstrikes and artillery barrages. Yet the victory came at a steep cost, measured not only in lives, but in the physical and psychological exhaustion of the men who had fought there. For those who stood on Tapochau's summit, the view was not just of an island spread beneath them, it was of the road ahead, a grim reminder that much of Saipan still lay in Japanese hands, and even bloodier days awaited. But for the first time, the Americans could see the island as a whole, and they knew that with Tapochau in their grasp, the tide of battle had shifted irreversibly in their favor. As the battle for Saipan dragged deeper into June, American forces soon realized that the island itself was a weapon, molded and reshaped by Japanese ingenuity and desperation. The rocky cliffs, porous volcanic ridges, and jagged escarpments had been transformed into a labyrinth of strongpoints, each one a miniature fortress hidden within the landscape. Unlike the beaches or open fields, here the enemy did not face them in the open. Instead, he lurked in the shadows behind stone and earth. Caves had been enlarged and reinforced, with firing ports cut into rock, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint the source of hostile fire. Some openings were concealed by brush, while others were crafted to blend seamlessly with natural rock formations. The Japanese used these caves not only as firing positions, but as living quarters, hospitals, and command posts. They were interconnected by narrow tunnels, creating a network that allowed defenders to vanish from one spot only to reappear in another. For the Americans, the fight ahead would be one of patience, ingenuity, and unimaginable danger. The typical cave complex often featured multiple entrances and firing apertures, arranged in such a way that one opening could cover the approach to another. This meant that assaulting a cave head-on almost always resulted in deadly crossfire from hidden angles. Machine guns positioned inside were shielded by thick rock, impervious to small arms fire, and difficult even for heavy artillery to neutralize. Grenades lobbed inside often failed to penetrate far enough, as the chambers twisted and extended deep underground. To complicate matters further, Japanese engineers had prepared secondary tunnels that allowed defenders to retreat or counterattack from behind advancing US troops. In effect, the caves functioned as a three-dimensional battlefield, with enemies appearing from unseen angles and disappearing just as quickly. The soldiers and marines found themselves in a war where every step forward had to be won twice, once above ground and again beneath the surface. American infantry had to adapt quickly, for their standard tactics of maneuver and firepower lost much of their effectiveness against subterranean defenses. Riflemen learned to advance cautiously, hugging the ground as flamethrower teams and demolition squads prepared to root out stubborn pockets of resistance. Engineers were often at the forefront, carrying satchel charges of TNT, demolition blocks, and flamethrowers strapped to their backs. It was a terrifying job, requiring them to walk toward dark holes from which unseen death could emerge at any second. The flamethrower, though heavy and cumbersome, became one of the most feared weapons of the campaign, as its streams of burning fuel could reach into depths that bullets could not. The sight of flames pouring into a cave often forced survivors to flee into the open, where they were met with concentrated rifle and machine gun fire. In many cases, however, Japanese troops preferred to burn alive rather than surrender, further shocking the Americans with the enemy's determination to fight to the last breath. 2 was. At night, the caves came alive in a different way. Under cover of darkness, Japanese soldiers crept from hidden exits to launch sudden raids against American positions. slipping past sentries and striking supply lines or artillery crews. They carried grenades, satchel charges, and even bayonets, relying on stealth and the element of surprise to sow chaos. Sometimes they infiltrated so deeply that they attacked field hospitals, slashing open tents and setting fires before vanishing back into the night. For exhausted Marines and soldiers, sleep became a fleeting luxury, interrupted by the constant fear of ghostly figures emerging from the black. These raids often had little tactical effect on the outcome of the battle, but they reinforced the psychological torment of fighting an enemy who seemed impossible to pin down. By day the caves were fortresses, by night they were portals through which sudden terror poured into American lines. Heavy firepower became the American answer to this subterranean challenge, as commanders increasingly turned to artillery, naval gunfire, and aerial bombardment to collapse cave systems. Naval guns lobbed shells that blasted away entire cliff faces, sending tons of rock crashing down to seal entrances. Bombers dropped napalm, whose searing waves of fire rolled into cave mouths and suffocated those within. Yet even after such devastating strikes, survivors often emerged from alternate exits, bloodied but still defiant, their will unbroken. Bulldozers were sometimes brought forward to push earth and debris into openings, burying defenders alive. These brutal measures reflected the grim calculus of the Pacific War, where mercy was rare, and the price of hesitation could be the lives of entire squads. For the Americans, destroying a cave meant not just eliminating soldiers, it meant dismantling a fortress that had been carefully constructed to kill them. The psychological strain of cave warfare was immense. Every boulder, every crevice in a cliffside, seemed capable of hiding a deadly ambush. Troops advanced with a gnawing sense of paranoia, never certain if the next step would trigger gunfire, an explosion, or the sudden appearance of enemy bayonets. The smell of burned flesh, lingering after flamethrower attacks, haunted men long after the fighting moved on. Many later confessed that the caves felt like portals to another world, a subterranean hell where life and death were decided in seconds of chaos and flame. Combat in these environments robbed men of the illusion of control. Battles were fought not against visible ranks of soldiers, but against shadows, darkness, and the unknown. In the fields of Saipan, courage was often measured not in grand charges, but in the slow, dreadful crawl toward a hole in the earth that might conceal certain death. Japanese use of caves also symbolized their broader doctrine of defense in depth, turning every natural feature of Saipan into part of a killing ground. Hillsides that appeared abandoned might suddenly erupt with gunfire from cave mouths, pinning down advancing platoons. Even when Americans seized ridges or high ground, defenders could reappear behind them through concealed tunnels. This forced US units to fight the same ground multiple times, advancing, clearing, and then being attacked again from unexpected directions. It was a form of attrition warfare, bleeding the invaders step by step and testing their resolve as much as their firepower. To break this defense required patience, teamwork, and a grim willingness to employ the most destructive weapons at hand. In the end, the caves of Saipan became symbols of both Japanese resilience and American determination, locking the two sides in a struggle as claustrophobic as it was merciless. By the close of June, the Americans had developed a grim efficiency in dealing with caves, though at terrible human cost. Flamethrower teams were shielded by riflemen, demolition squads followed with satchel charges, and engineers sealed off entrances to prevent reoccupation. Yet the process repeated itself again and again, for there were always more caves, more tunnels, more pockets of men willing to die underground. Each conquered position brought not relief, but the knowledge that the next ridge would hold the same horrors. For the Japanese, these caves embodied their vow to defend Saipan to the last man, For the Americans, they became grim reminders of the price required to capture each mile of ground. The battle for the caves was not just a tactical challenge, it was a test of endurance, pitting American firepower and determination against Japanese ingenuity and an unyielding will to fight from the shadows. As the Americans pressed deeper into Saipan, the Japanese command understood that their best chance of breaking the momentum lay not in static defense, but in explosive counterattack. General Yoshitsugu Saitō, his forces dwindling and his supply lines collapsing, clung to the doctrine of shock assaults to destabilize the invaders. These attacks were not tactically refined, but were rooted in a culture that valued death over surrender, a ferocity that terrified even hardened U.S. Marines. The defenders chose darkness as their ally, slipping through cane fields, ravines, and jagged ridges to surprise American positions. Every night flares illuminated the sky, and the eerie sound of Japanese bugles signaled another desperate push. In the stillness, the cries of Tenno Haika Banzai, "Long live the Emperor," erupted as waves of soldiers charged into withering fire. The Japanese infantry advanced without hesitation, often with bayonets fixed, swords raised, or even bare hands when ammunition ran dry. To them, honor outweighed survival, and death in such a charge was considered a sacred offering. For the Americans, each attack was a nightmare that fused chaos, bravery, and sheer terror. The counterattacks began to define the psychological edge of Saipan's battle, where no foxhole felt safe after dusk. The first major counterattacks began just days after the landings, when Japanese forces sought to drive the Marines back into the sea. Around Charan Kanoa, under the cover of artillery and mortar fire, Japanese infantry surged forward in coordinated but ultimately suicidal charges. The Marines had braced for such an event, their machine guns and mortars zeroed in on likely approaches. The result was slaughter, with entire Japanese platoons mowed down before they could reach the American lines. Yet even as losses mounted, the defenders pressed forward, often managing to infiltrate pockets of American positions and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Marines recalled fighting in the dark with knives, entrenching tools, and even bare fists. For the Japanese, the willingness to absorb casualties in exchange for inflicting panic was a calculated choice. The night sky glowed with muzzle flashes, tracers, and exploding shells as screams of the wounded echoed across the beaches and fields. By dawn, thousands of Japanese bodies littered the ground, but the survivors retreated only to regroup. These early clashes were a grim reminder to the Americans that their enemy fought with a desperation unlike anything encountered in Europe. The nature of these counterattacks forced American commanders to rethink their perimeter defense. Foxholes were deepened, barbed wire strung, and fields of fire carefully overlapped. Marines and soldiers learned to sleep lightly, if at all, during the nights on Saipan, knowing that the next charge could come at any moment. Flares were kept at the ready to turn night into a blinding glare to expose advancing figures. Mortar teams were trained to drop pre-sighted rounds on likely approach routes with seconds' notice. Even with these precautions, Japanese soldiers found ways to infiltrate through gullies, ravines, and hidden trails. Small groups slipped through American lines to sow havoc in the rear, attacking medics, supply runners, and artillery crews. For the men of the U.S. divisions, there was a creeping realization that nowhere was truly safe. The constant tension weighed heavily on their nerves, a slow erosion of calm that made rest nearly impossible. The counterattacks were not just battles of bullets and bayonets, but of endurance, psychology, and the unrelenting will to survive. 10. The most infamous of these counterattacks came in the form of the Banzai charge, a tactic already seen on other Pacific islands, but never at the scale Saipan would witness. These massed assaults, combined the ritualistic cries of devotion to the emperor with the frenzied rush of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of soldiers. Bayonets gleamed in the moonlight as columns surged across open ground in a desperate bid to break American formations. While tactically futile, the psychological shock was profound. Veterans of the fight described it as a tidal wave of humanity, unstoppable until shattered by overwhelming firepower. The defenders showed no hesitation even as machine guns scythed them down in rows and grenades ripped through their ranks. The courage was undeniable, but so too was the futility. Each charge depleted irreplaceable manpower for Japan. For the Marines and soldiers holding the line, the experience was one of horror and awe in equal measure. To them these were not just enemies, but men choosing death in the name of an emperor who would never see them fall. June nights on Saipan became theaters of madness, where order dissolved into survival. Entire companies of Japanese troops launched themselves into the teeth of American defenses, sometimes accompanied by tanks in desperate last pushes. These nighttime counterattacks were timed to exploit confusion and fatigue, seeking to break the rhythm of the invasion. The fighting often devolved into melee combat, with men grappling in the dark, bayonets clashing, and grenades tossed blindly into shadows. American machine gunners were pushed to their limits, firing until barrels overheated, while mortar crews scrambled to maintain a relentless curtain of fire. Japanese officers led from the front, often wielding sabers, urging their men forward even as they themselves were cut down. Many attackers carried satchel charges, seeking to blow themselves up alongside tanks, artillery pieces, or bunkers. The defenders' fanaticism shocked American troops, who struggled to comprehend such disregard for life. By morning the battlefield was a graveyard of corpses, yet survivors prepared to do it all over again. Saipan had become a crucible, where human will was tested in its most extreme form. The largest and most devastating Banzai charge of the entire Pacific War occurred on Saipan in early July. With his forces shattered and his defeat imminent, General Saitō ordered one final assault, a mass suicide attack intended to annihilate as many Americans as possible. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers, including wounded men pulled from hospitals, surged in a single wave against American lines. The attack smashed into the 27th Infantry Division, overrunning some positions and causing one of the bloodiest clashes of the campaign. American soldiers were bayoneted in their foxholes, artillery pieces destroyed, and medics slaughtered as they tried to tend to the wounded. The defenders penetrated deeply before overwhelming firepower finally broke them. Hundreds of Japanese fell within yards of their objective, leaving heaps of bodies in their wake. For the Americans who survived, the night became seared into memory as a vision of hell itself. The scale of the carnage was staggering, and its impact rippled through the entire campaign. After that charge, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan began to unravel completely. For the Americans, these counterattacks, while terrifying, ultimately confirmed the futility of Japanese strategy. Each charge bled Japan of men who could never be replaced, hastening the collapse of their defense. Yet victory came at a heavy price, with American casualties mounting from both the fighting and the strain of constant readiness. Soldiers and Marines bore the scars of sleepless nights, haunted by the memory of comrades cut down in the chaos. Chaplains worked tirelessly to comfort men shaken by the ferocity of the enemy's willingness to die. Letters home struggled to capture the reality, with many choosing silence rather than words inadequate to describe the madness. Commanders recognized that Japanese tactics, while emotionally devastating, lacked the tactical sophistication needed to alter the battle's outcome. Still, the psychological toll lingered, as even seasoned veterans admitted to nightmares of Banzai charges long after the island was secured. the Americans adapted, grew tougher, and resolved never to underestimate their foe again. Saipan, through these counterattacks, became not just a military confrontation, but a grim lesson in the cost of fanatical devotion. Do things, sir. In the end, the Japanese counterattacks on Saipan epitomized the tragic clash of cultures in the Pacific War. On one side stood an army willing to sacrifice itself completely, bound by honor and obedience to the emperor. On the other side, a modern industrial force that relied on overwhelming firepower, discipline, and resilience. The result was carnage, on a scale that left the island soaked in blood and the combatants scarred for life. For the Japanese, the Banzai charges became a symbol of defiance, remembered with reverence and sorrow. For the Americans, they were unforgettable nightmares, moments of chaos that tested courage and sanity. The counterattacks could not halt the inexorable American advance, but they ensured that victory would come only at a terrible price. Saipan became both a triumph and a tragedy, a battlefield where human endurance met its limits. And in those furious nighttime clashes, the world glimpsed the terrifying depth of a nation's will to fight, even when the outcome was already sealed. The echoes of those cries, Banzai, still haunt the memory of the Pacific War, a testament to courage and futility intertwined. As dawn broke over Saipan on July 7th, 1944, the island was poised to witness one of the most dramatic and tragic spectacles of the Pacific War, the largest Banzai charge ever recorded. The Japanese garrison, once numbering over 30,000, had been reduced by weeks of relentless American assaults, naval bombardments, and grinding attritional battles. General Yoshitsugu Saitō, his forces shattered and supplies nearly exhausted, faced the grim reality of impending defeat. Yet surrender was not an option in the Imperial Japanese Army's code of honor, where death was preferable to capture. That night, after issuing final orders and a farewell message, invoking the Emperor and the spirit of Bushido, Saitō prepared his men for a final charge into history. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and even lightly armed civilians were drawn into this last desperate act of defiance. Gathering at first light, they formed a column 1,000 strong, armed with rifles, bayonets, swords, and even bamboo spears, with cries of Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor. They surged forward in one mass. What followed was both horrifying and unforgettable, a moment that seared itself into the memory of every American who survived it. The Banzai charge began like a tidal wave, a human flood crashing against the American lines. At its head were officers brandishing samurai swords, followed by soldiers in ragged uniforms and bandaged wounds, their eyes burning with fatal resolve. Many had no ammunition left, carrying only bayonets affixed to their rifles, while others grasped grenades or improvised spears. The ground shook beneath the collective thunder of thousands of boots, echoing across the fields and ridges of northern Saipan. The sight was surreal, a vast column stretching over half a mile, screaming in unison as it descended upon the American 105th Infantry Regiment. For the Americans, it was a moment of shock and disbelief, unlike anything they had seen in the Pacific Campaign thus far. The defenders opened fire with rifles, machine guns, and mortars, cutting swaths through the charging mass. Still, the Japanese pressed forward, climbing over fallen comrades, determined to carry the momentum into the heart of the American positions. It was a terrifying spectacle, one that blurred the line between disciplined attack and suicidal madness. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry bore the brunt of this onslaught. Their foxholes, machine gun nests, and artillery pieces became focal points of savage hand-to-hand fighting. Some American positions were overrun entirely, with defenders stabbed, bludgeoned, or bayoneted as the Japanese crashed through their lines. Soldiers who had fought in North Africa or Europe later recalled that nothing in their previous experience prepared them for the raw ferocity of this attack. The chaos was absolute, with gunfire, screams, and explosions mixing into a nightmarish cacophony. Medics trying to tend to the wounded were cut down, and supply lines crumbled under the sheer momentum of the assault. Even the wounded Japanese threw themselves forward, crawling with grenades clutched to their chests, detonating among clusters of American soldiers. Units dissolved into small, desperate pockets of resistance, each fighting for survival in the storm. The Americans realized they were not fighting against mere military tactics, but against a collective will to die for honor. St. Paul. The charge ripped through the front lines, creating pockets of disaster within the American positions. Entire companies of the 105th were annihilated, some reduced to a fraction of their original strength within minutes. Officers tried to rally their men, shouting orders above the din, but the sheer scale of the assault left little time for coordination. In one sector, Japanese soldiers stormed artillery positions, killing crews with bayonets and seizing the very guns that had pounded them for weeks. The 75 mm and 105 mm howitzers fell silent as their operators were butchered. Japanese flags appeared briefly above captured positions, symbols of their desperate but fleeting success. Yet the Americans refused to break completely. Small groups held fast, pouring bullets and grenades into the charging masses. Their determination, backed by the firepower of machine guns and mortars, slowly began to erode the momentum of the attackers. But the cost was staggering, with some American platoons losing over half their men in a single hour. Even as casualties mounted, the Japanese wave did not falter. Reinforced by stragglers from across the island, the charge seemed unending, as if the very earth was vomiting forth its defenders in one final convulsion. Civilians who had been coerced into service, elderly men, teenage boys, and even women armed with sharpened sticks, ran alongside soldiers, their voices blending into the chorus of Banzai. For the Americans, the horror was compounded by the realization that this was not just a military maneuver, but a cultural and spiritual ritual of mass sacrifice. Japanese commanders rode at the forefront, some cutting down Americans with swords before being riddled with bullets. The clash became a grotesque melee, where bayonet met bayonet, rifle butt smashed against helmet, and men fought until both collapsed in exhaustion and blood. It was warfare at its most primal, stripped of strategy, fought only with willpower, steel, and desperation. By mid-morning, the battlefield was a charnel house, littered with bodies piled 3 and 4 deep. Amid the carnage, acts of extraordinary bravery emerged on both sides. American soldiers stood their ground in foxholes until the last round was fired, then drew knives or fists to repel attackers. In one artillery position, crews fought to the death around their howitzers, determined not to let them fall into enemy hands again. Japanese soldiers, even when mortally wounded, dragged themselves forward, striking one final blow before collapsing. Corpsmen worked frantically to save lives, carrying wounded men through fields, swept by gunfire, often paying with their own lives. The psychological strain on the defenders was immense, with some describing the attack as a nightmare made flesh. Yet amid the terror, the cohesion of American units, reinforced by discipline and training, began to reassert itself. Officers and NCOs rallied survivors, forming new defensive lines even as the dead and dying lay around them. Slowly, the firepower advantage began to tell. Machine guns, mortars, and even tanks, brought up from the rear, poured destruction into the thinning Japanese ranks. By noon, the great Banzai charge had spent its fury. Thousands of Japanese lay dead across the battlefield, their bodies carpeting the ridges, fields, and roads leading into the American perimeter. Estimates suggest that between 3,000 and 5,000 men were killed in that single cataclysmic assault. The 105th Infantry alone suffered over 900 casualties, with entire companies erased from the roster in just a few hours. Survivors wandered in shock, their uniforms soaked in blood, their weapons broken from overuse. The Japanese who survived the charge did not retreat. Instead, they fought to the last breath, often detonating grenades upon themselves to avoid capture. For the Americans, the victory was Pyrrhic, a defense purchased with unimaginable cost in blood and trauma. The scale of the carnage stunned even hardened veterans of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. It was a day that revealed both the depth of Japanese fanaticism and the resilience of American soldiers standing against impossible odds. The Great Banzai Charge of July 7th marked the effective end of organized Japanese resistance on Saipan. In its wake, the battlefield was transformed into a vast graveyard, where the tropical sun quickly turned the fallen into grim reminders of the ferocity of the struggle. General Saitō himself had committed ritual suicide, following the traditional path of seppuku rather than endure defeat. His final act was emblematic of the ethos that had driven thousands of his men to rush headlong into death. For the Americans, the charge was both a tactical triumph and a psychological scar, an experience they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. It demonstrated the lengths to which Japanese forces would go to resist capture, a preview of the even bloodier battles to come on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The story of July 7th became a defining chapter in the narrative of Saipan, a moment of horror and heroism that encapsulated the savage struggle for the Pacific. In the smoke and silence that followed, the island's fate was sealed, but the memory of that day would never fade. As the battle for Saipan entered its final stages in early July 1944, the US military encountered not just soldiers entrenched in caves and ridges, but thousands of Japanese civilians caught in the crossfire. These civilians included entire families, fathers, mothers, children, and the elderly, who had been brought to Saipan by the Japanese colonial administration in the years before the war. They were laborers, farmers, clerks, and shopkeepers, living alongside the military presence that had transformed the island into a fortress. Many were Okinawan or Korean conscripts, displaced and forced to work in support of the Imperial Japanese war machine. For months before the invasion, they had been fed a steady stream of propaganda from Japanese authorities. They were told that Americans were brutal barbarians who would kill men, rape women, and enslave children. The civilian population, terrified and desperate, prepared themselves for what they believed to be inevitable horror. As American forces pushed northward, the fate of these civilians became intertwined with the battle. Their tragedy was one of the darkest legacies of the Battle of Saipan, an episode that revealed the human cost of war in its most heartbreaking form. The propaganda machine in Saipan worked tirelessly in the months leading up to the invasion. Posters, radio broadcasts, and speeches from local Japanese officials warned civilians that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. School children were taught that Americans would torture them, while mothers were instructed to take their own lives, and those of their children, if capture became unavoidable. Japanese officers distributed grenades to some families and encouraged mass suicide as a final act of loyalty to the emperor. Entire communities rehearsed how they would leap from cliffs rather than fall into enemy hands. This psychological conditioning created a climate of hysteria long before the US Marines landed on the beaches. The Japanese military used civilians as human shields, placing them near fortifications or forcing them to carry supplies to frontline troops. Some civilians dug defensive trenches under the supervision of armed soldiers, blurring the line between combatant and non-combatant. by the time American troops advanced north, these terrified civilians were already primed to see death as their only escape. Their fear was not rooted in reality, but in carefully constructed lies that magnified the tragedy still to come. As American forces advanced toward the northern end of Saipan, they encountered large groups of civilians fleeing into the hills and caves. Soldiers of the U.S. Army and Marines were startled to find terrified mothers clutching infants, old men trembling in fear, and children screaming at the mere sight of an American helmet. The troops tried, in halting Japanese or through interpreters, to reassure them that they would not be harmed. Leaflets had been dropped from aircraft urging civilians to surrender peacefully, but years of indoctrination had made such words meaningless to many. Some civilians hesitated, torn between survival and the fear of dishonor. Others were herded by Japanese soldiers toward the cliffs of Marpi Point, a promontory overlooking the ocean, where they would make their final stand. The Americans could only watch in horror as families clung together, preparing to leap to their deaths. For many U.S. soldiers, this was unlike anything they had seen in combat. They were prepared to fight an enemy army, but not to witness the mass destruction of innocent civilian lives. The cliffs at Marpi Point, on Saipan's northern edge, became the most tragic stage of the battle. Here, hundreds of Japanese civilians gathered as American forces closed in. The jagged rocks at the base of the cliffs and the crashing Pacific waves below offered no mercy, yet families willingly chose this fate. Mothers cradled infants as they leapt, fathers pulled entire families with them, and groups of children were pushed forward by their parents. Some survivors recalled the haunting cries that echoed as bodies hit the rocks and the sea. American soldiers pleaded with them, using interpreters, bullhorns, and hand gestures begging them to stop. Many soldiers dropped their rifles and extended their hands in desperate attempts to show they meant no harm. But fear and indoctrination proved stronger than reason, and the tide of humanity continued to fall into the ocean below. The cliffs, which had once been natural monuments overlooking Saipan's beauty, became soaked in blood and sorrow. This episode was not a battle. It was a mass tragedy that scarred everyone who witnessed it. American troops, deeply shaken, tried everything to prevent the suicides. They tossed food rations and water toward hiding civilians, showing that they wanted to offer aid rather than harm. Chaplains and Japanese-American interpreters shouted reassurances that surrender was safe and honorable. Some soldiers risked their lives by advancing under sniper fire, attempting to rescue civilians from caves where families were preparing to kill themselves. A few small groups of civilians did surrender, sobbing in relief when they discovered that the Americans treated them with kindness. These rescues gave fleeting hope to the U.S. troops, but the scale of the tragedy overwhelmed them, as more and more civilians chose death. Witnesses described soldiers weeping openly as they watched entire families leap together. For battle-hardened Marines, who had endured weeks of combat, this was a moment that broke even the toughest among them. War had conditioned them to accept death in battle, but they were unprepared for mass suicide on such a scale. The emotional weight of Marpi Point lingered long after the island was declared secure. The Japanese military leadership bore heavy responsibility for this civilian tragedy. Orders from commanders instructed civilians to fight or die rather than surrender, framing mass suicide as a patriotic act. Officers stood among the crowds at Marpi Point, urging families to jump. Grenades were passed out so that groups could die together in explosions, rather than be captured alive. Some soldiers forced civilians toward the cliffs at gunpoint, determined to maintain the illusion of loyalty to the emperor even in death. For those indoctrinated by years of propaganda, resistance to such commands was almost unthinkable. The line between military coercion and personal choice blurred in those final hours, leaving a legacy of confusion and grief. Later Japanese survivors would recall the immense pressure to comply with what seemed like the only acceptable path. To them, survival was not an option. They had been taught that only death preserved their honor. Thus, the tragedy of Marpi Point was not merely a moment of despair, but the result of systematic manipulation and fear. The death toll among civilians at Saipan was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 8,000 and 10,000 civilians perished during the battle, many of them in the mass suicides at Marpi Point and other cliffs. Families disappeared into the ocean, leaving only fragments of belongings, broken sandals and children's toys scattered along the rocks. Survivors described the ocean turning red with blood as waves carried bodies back to shore. For the American soldiers who bore witness, these images were seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. Some wrote in letters home that they could never forget the sight of mothers hurling babies into the sea before following them. The tragedy haunted veterans long after the war ended, with many describing Saipan as the most horrific experience of their service. Unlike combat, which could be rationalized as soldier against soldier, the loss of civilians was harder to reconcile. It reminded all who witnessed it that war does not spare the innocent. Saipan became not just a military victory, but a moral and emotional scar for both sides. The civilian tragedy on Saipan remains one of the most haunting episodes of World War II in the Pacific. It revealed the devastating impact of propaganda, the cruelty of military leadership, and the terrible choices forced upon ordinary people. Today, monuments at Marpi Point honor both the civilians who died and the soldiers who tried to save them. Visitors stand at the cliffs, looking out at the same waves where thousands once perished, and reflect on the madness of war. For historians, the event underscores how battles are not only measured in territory gained, but in lives destroyed. The suicides at Saipan showed that victory carried a human cost that could not be erased. It also became a grim foreshadowing of what might occur if Japan itself were invaded, influencing later decisions about how to end the war. The tragedy of Marpi Point remains a reminder that in war, the greatest casualties are often those who never picked up a weapon. Their loss is a story that must continue to be told, not just as history but as a warning for generations to come. On the morning of July 9, 1944, after nearly a month of relentless combat, American commanders finally declared the island of Saipan secure. The announcement carried the weight of triumph, but also the echo of staggering loss. For the Marines and soldiers who had clawed their way across beaches, ridges, and caves, the word secure felt almost alien, as the sights and sounds of war still lingered in their ears. The landscape around them bore little resemblance to the tropical paradise it had once been, now transformed into a wasteland of charred palm trees, ruined villages, and cratered earth. Yet the significance of the moment could not be overstated, for Saipan was more than just another island. It was the linchpin to the Marianas, and a gateway to Japan itself. Victory here marked the first time American forces had captured Japanese territory, considered part of the Empire's homeland. The Japanese had sworn Saipan would never fall, but the island now lay firmly under the American flag. For the men on the ground, this moment was less about geopolitical strategy and more about surviving to see the end of a battle that had seemed endless. Each Marine and soldier knew that their efforts had carved out a crucial foothold in the Pacific War. Yet, amid the sense of accomplishment, an unmistakable shadow hung over the victory. The cost of securing Saipan was staggering and evident everywhere one looked. The US forces suffered more than 3,000 dead and nearly 10,000 wounded, with countless others scarred physically and mentally from the ordeal. Japanese losses dwarfed those numbers, with over 30,000 soldiers killed in combat and thousands more civilians dead in the tragedy of Marpi Point. The ground was littered with silent testaments to this cost: rusting rifles, blood-soaked uniforms, and the bodies of soldiers who had fought to the last breath. Many Marines admitted that the violence they had endured on Saipan was unlike anything they had experienced before, with the Japanese fighting to the absolute end, refusing to surrender even when the cause was hopeless. For the Japanese, the battle had been waged with the weight of national honor and desperation, and they paid for it with near annihilation. The American victory, though decisive, was not one that could be celebrated with joy. The island had been won, but the human cost was incalculable, and it left many veterans grappling with the haunting question of whether any island was worth such devastation. Strategically, however, the capture of Saipan was a turning point in the Pacific War. The island's airfields provided the US with bases from which B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. From Saipan, the long-range bombing campaign against Tokyo and other industrial centers would soon begin, bringing the war directly to Japan's doorstep for the first time. American planners recognized immediately that the fall of Saipan had shifted the balance of the war irrevocably. The Japanese High Command, equally aware of the implications, knew their defensive perimeter had been irreparably breached. The loss of Saipan sent shockwaves through the halls of power in Tokyo, undermining confidence in military leadership and hastening the downfall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. Thus, the carnage on Saipan extended far beyond its shores, setting into motion political upheaval in Japan that would alter the trajectory of the war. What the soldiers had bled for on the ground was now about to reshape the global conflict at its highest levels. The psychological toll on the American troops who survived was profound, leaving scars that would endure long after the battle. Soldiers described Saipan as a place where death seemed omnipresent, where every step forward felt like a gamble against fate. Veterans recalled the haunting cries of civilians at Marpi Point, the guttural war chants of Japanese soldiers launching their final Banzai charges, and the deafening roars of naval bombardments that turned night into day. Sleep was a luxury they could not afford, and even when it returned, nightmares replayed the horrors they had witnessed. Letters home, written in shaky handwriting on scraps of paper, attempted to convey the enormity of what they had endured, though words often failed them. For many, Saipan was the battle that defined their service, an experience that forged unbreakable bonds among comrades, while also creating wounds that time could never fully heal. The declaration of victory did not erase those memories. It only marked the beginning of their lifelong struggle to live with them. The Japanese perspective of Saipan's fall was equally harrowing, shaped by a mix of shame, grief, and national despair. General Yoshitsugu Saito's death, alongside his fellow commanders, symbolized the collapse of organized resistance and the end of an impossible defense. Survivors who managed to escape capture described a sense of betrayal, feeling abandoned by Tokyo, which had promised Saipan would be reinforced and never surrendered. The civilian deaths, particularly the mass suicides, left an indelible stain on Japan's wartime psyche, becoming a symbol of both loyalty and tragedy. In Japanese propaganda, Saipan was portrayed as a noble sacrifice, but in reality, it revealed the futility of the empire's war strategy. The Japanese people would later learn that the fall of Saipan had been a major factor in the resignation of Prime Minister Tojo, whose government could no longer withstand the mounting tide of defeats. For the Japanese nation, Saipan was more than a lost island, it was the beginning of the end. On the island itself, the aftermath of battle was a scene of near-apocalyptic ruin. Villages were reduced to rubble, their homes burned or blasted apart by artillery. Fields of sugarcane, once the lifeblood of Saipan's economy, lay trampled and scorched, their soil blackened by fire and blood. Roads were clogged with wrecked tanks, smouldering trucks, and abandoned Japanese artillery pieces. The smell of death hung heavy in the humid air, mixing with the acrid stench of smoke and cordite. American engineers and Seabees quickly set to work transforming this wreckage into usable infrastructure, clearing debris, and preparing the island's airfields for the arrival of B-29 bombers. Yet even amid these efforts, reminders of the battle were inescapable, with graves hastily dug in the earth and crosses dotting the hillsides. For the civilians who survived, life on Saipan would never be the same, as they navigated the ruins of their homes and the trauma of war that had engulfed their island. For US commanders, Saipan became a symbol of both accomplishment and warning. The ferocity of Japanese resistance demonstrated that every mile toward Japan would be contested with unimaginable violence. The loss of life among American forces prompted serious reflection about the cost of continuing the island-hopping strategy, even as the campaign pressed forward. Saipan had revealed the brutal determination of Japanese soldiers and civilians alike to resist until the very end, a foreshadowing of the even bloodier battles that awaited on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Yet for the Americans, there was no turning back. The victory on Saipan had opened the path to Tokyo, and the momentum of war demanded they push forward. Commanders recognized that while Saipan was a victory, it was also a grim preview of the challenges to come. The lessons learned here would shape military strategy for the remainder of the Pacific War. As the sun set on July 9th, the American flag waved firmly over the ruins of Saipan, a symbol of triumph amid devastation. The battle had tested the limits of endurance, courage, and sacrifice for both sides, leaving behind a legacy of valor and tragedy. For the United States, the victory secured a foothold that would bring the war closer to Japan than ever before. For the Japanese, the loss marked the collapse of their defensive perimeter and the shattering of their illusion of invincibility. Saipan had fallen, but the war was far from over. Its capture signaled not only a military victory, but also a shift in the psychological and political landscape of the Pacific. The island would soon become the launch point for a campaign of firebombing that would devastate Japan's cities and bring the war to its homeland. Saipan was secure, but the price paid for that security would echo in history forever. The fall of Saipan was both an ending and a beginning, a moment when the war changed course, setting the stage for its final fiery chapters. News of Saipan's fall struck Tokyo with the force of an earthquake. For months, Japan's military leadership had reassured the public that the Imperial Army was invincible and that the island defenses would hold against any American assault. But when word arrived that Saipan had fallen, the illusion of Japanese superiority was shattered beyond repair. Saipan was not a remote outpost. It was the gateway to the Japanese homeland, placing Tokyo itself within range of American B-29 bombers for the very first time. This fact reverberated through every layer of society, from the emperor's advisors to ordinary citizens who suddenly realized that the war was no longer a distant struggle. The shock was compounded by the sheer scale of losses, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians dead, and an island fortress that had been declared impregnable now in American hands. To many, it felt as if Japan's protective shield had been pierced, leaving the nation naked before its enemies. The aura of inevitability that had surrounded Japan's war machine was gone. The fall of Saipan was more than a military defeat. It was a national humiliation. The political consequences of this catastrophe were immediate and severe. Prime Minister Hideki Toyo, who had held both political and military power in his hands, found himself at the center of public outrage. For years, Toyo had symbolized the fusion of militarism and government, the embodiment of Japan's war policy, his confident speeches, full of promises of victory, now rang hollow in the face of undeniable disaster. Within the halls of power, critics who had remained silent began to speak openly, accusing him of arrogance, poor judgment, and the reckless pursuit of a war Japan could not win. Even within the imperial palace, whispers of dissatisfaction reached the emperor himself, who had begun to question Toyong's ability to lead the nation in its darkest hour. The prime minister, once hailed as a strong man, was now seen as the architect of disaster. His political rivals circled like vultures, waiting for the moment to strike. Saipan's loss had exposed him as vulnerable, and in Japan's rigid hierarchy, weakness could not be tolerated. As the Imperial Japanese Army tallied its losses, the gravity of the situation became clear. The Americans now had a base from which they could launch direct strikes against Japan's industrial centers, threatening the very foundation of the empire's war effort. The once booming factories of Nagoya, Osaka, and Tokyo itself were now within reach of devastating air raids. The navy, already crippled by losses in the Philippine Sea, could no longer guarantee the defense of the homeland. To the people of Japan, the fall of Saipan was an omen of doom, a sign that the tide had irreversibly turned. Within days, newspapers carried somber headlines, carefully crafted by censors, yet unable to mask the despair that gripped the nation. Ordinary citizens who had cheered victories in China and Southeast Asia now whispered fears of invasion. The confidence that Japan could dictate the terms of war had evaporated overnight, and as these realizations set in, the demand for political accountability grew impossible to ignore. Within the government, the walls closed in on Tojo. Ministers who had once pledged loyalty now distanced themselves, seeking to preserve their own reputations. The Imperial General Headquarters held tense meetings, with generals and admirals exchanging accusations rather than solutions. Some blamed the army for failing to defend Saipan with sufficient vigor, while others condemned the navy for allowing American carriers to dominate the seas. In reality, the disaster was the product of systemic overconfidence, poor strategy, and a refusal to adapt to modern warfare. Yet scapegoats were necessary, and Tojo, as both Prime Minister and War Minister, bore the brunt of responsibility. His position became untenable. Pressure mounted not only from within the cabinet, but also from the emperor's inner circle, where advisors quietly urged Hirohito to demand change. For the first time in years, the Prime Minister could no longer rely on the shield of the military establishment to protect him. The breaking point came in mid-July, just days after Saipan's official fall. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained largely detached from political affairs, began to take a more active role. Though cautious and soft-spoken, the emperor expressed dissatisfaction with the government's performance, signaling that Toyo no longer had his full confidence. This was a devastating blow, for in Japan's wartime political system, the emperor's opinion, though rarely voiced, carried absolute weight. When Hirohito's aides began quietly searching for alternative leadership, Toyo knew his fate was sealed. On July 18th, 1944, after frantic meetings and desperate attempts to retain power, he tendered his resignation as Prime Minister, along with his cabinet. The announcement shocked the public, though for many it was a grim acknowledgement of what they already knew. Japan was losing the war, and its leaders could no longer hide the truth. Tojo's resignation marked the collapse of the government that had led Japan into its most ambitious and ultimately disastrous war. It was more than just a change in leadership. It was a symbolic moment that revealed cracks within the very system that had sustained Japan's militarism. For years the military had dominated the state, silencing dissent and pushing the nation toward expansion and conquest. Now, with Saipan lost and the homeland itself threatened, Even the generals and admirals could not maintain the illusion of invulnerability. The resignation exposed deep divisions within the ruling elite, between those who wanted to fight to the bitter end and those who quietly sought a path toward negotiation. It also signaled to the Japanese people that their leaders were not infallible, that the empire's destiny was no longer guided by unshakable hands. The myth of unity began to crumble. In the aftermath of Tokyo's fall, Japan scrambled to form a new government. Leadership passed briefly to General Kuniaki Koiso, but his appointment did little to restore confidence. Koiso lacked Tokyo's commanding presence and found himself constrained by the same military bureaucracy that had shackled his predecessor. He inherited a war effort already spiraling out of control, with dwindling resources, collapsing morale, and an increasingly desperate military strategy. To the Allies, the change in leadership was largely irrelevant. The war machine remained intact, and Japan showed no signs of surrender. Yet within Tokyo, the shift marked the beginning of political unraveling. Power struggles intensified, factions formed, and the once unified facade of military dictatorship gave way to an atmosphere of uncertainty. Even the emperor, who had traditionally remained above politics, began to play a larger role, intervening in decisions with increasing frequency. The fall of Saipan and Tokyo's resignation were turning points not just in the war, but in the destiny of Japan itself. They revealed the fragility of a system built on rigid hierarchy, propaganda, and blind faith in military supremacy. For the Japanese people, the events of July 1944 shattered illusions of inevitable victory and opened the door to doubt, fear, and disillusionment. For the Allies, it was a signal that Japan was vulnerable, not just militarily but politically, and that continued pressure would only deepen the cracks in the empire's foundations. The shockwaves from Saipan rippled far beyond the Pacific battlefield. They reached into the heart of Tokyo, shaking the pillars of power and exposing the empire's slow descent into collapse. In the months to come, these cracks would widen, leading Japan inexorably toward its final reckoning. The fall of Saipan was not just the loss of an island, it was the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. The fall of Saipan was more than the loss of a single island. It marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. For centuries, the Japanese homeland had remained beyond the reach of foreign armies, protected by distance, seas, and tradition. Now, with Saipan firmly in American hands, the very heart of Japan's empire lay within striking range. From its newly secured airfields, the mighty B-29 superfortresses could take to the skies and fly directly over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. This shifted the balance of power in the Pacific in a way that no naval victory or blockade could. The psychological blow to Japan was immense, shattering the myth of an untouchable homeland. The men who fought and died on Saipan had opened the gates to a new kind of war, one that would be waged in the skies over Japan itself. The strategic importance of Saipan stemmed from its location deep within the Marianas, nearly 1,500 miles from the Japanese home islands. No other captured territory provided the same launch point for long-range bombers. From airstrips carved into the island's volcanic terrain, American forces could unleash waves of bombers that bypassed the need for vulnerable carrier operations. For the first time, Japan's sprawling urban centers, its factories, and its cultural heartlands would face devastation from above. This was not a symbolic threat. It was the practical beginning of the strategic bombing campaign that would define the closing year of the Pacific War. Saipan transformed from a bloody battlefield into the fulcrum of America's next offensive, the systematic dismantling of Japan's war-making capacity. The capture of Saipan also had cascading consequences across the Pacific theater. The island became the forward base for subsequent invasions, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which would bring American forces ever closer to Japan's doorstep. Each of these operations was planned with Saipan as the springboard, allowing the US Navy and Marine Corps to coordinate supply chains, launch amphibious assaults, and support the advance with aerial bombardment. Without Saipan, the logistics of striking Japan directly would have been nearly impossible. Its harbors, runways, and communication hubs became the beating heart of the Allied advance westward. The Pacific was vast, but with Saipan secured, the Allies had finally created an anchor point from which the noose around Japan could be tightened. For Japan, the loss of Saipan was catastrophic beyond the battlefield. It severed the Empire's defensive perimeter, which had been carefully constructed to keep enemy forces at bay. The Marianas were not meant to fall. Their capture by the Americans revealed the fragility of Japan's outer ring of defenses. Militarily, it meant that Japan could no longer shield its industrial heartlands from sustained assault. Politically, it exposed the vulnerability of Emperor Hirohito's empire, shaking confidence in the military leadership that had promised victory. And socially, it signaled to the Japanese people that the war was shifting from distant territories to their very homes. The fall of Saipan was not just a tactical defeat, it was an existential one. The American victory at Saipan also accelerated technological and doctrinal shifts that would define the remainder of the war. The deployment of the B-29 superfortress was unlike anything the world had seen before. A massive bomber capable of flying higher, farther, and carrying heavier payloads than any aircraft in history. Saipan's airfields became its launching pad, allowing formations of B-29 size to hammer Japan relentlessly. The transition from naval battles and island assaults to strategic bombing marked a new phase of the Pacific War. It was the grim prelude to the firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of industrial cities, and eventually the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Saipan therefore was not simply a victory, it was the threshold of a new and far deadlier chapter of the war. The victory on Saipan also forced Japan into desperate recalculations. The Imperial Navy, already crippled by defeats in the Philippine Sea, could no longer project strength across the Pacific. With its aircraft carriers shattered, and its fuel supplies dwindling, Japan's options narrowed to defensive attrition and suicidal resistance. This new reality shaped Japanese strategy at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where defenders dug deep into caves, tunnels, and fortifications, determined to exact horrific casualties on the Americans. The seeds of these bloody battles were sown on Saipan, where the Japanese High Command realized they could no longer meet the US in open battle. Instead, the war would be dragged out in brutal, grinding combat designed to delay the inevitable. For the Allies, Saipan became both a triumph and a warning. The victory proved that no Japanese stronghold was unassailable, but it also revealed the staggering cost of each conquest. Nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers died on Saipan, alongside thousands of civilians, and over 14,000 American casualties were sustained. The blood spilled on Saipan foreshadowed the nightmare of Okinawa, where even greater losses would follow. Military planners understood that if Japan itself had to be invaded, the toll would be unimaginably high. Saipan's conquest thus directly influenced the eventual decision to use atomic weapons, as leaders sought a way to end the war without incurring millions of Allied and Japanese deaths in a land invasion. In this sense, Saipan was not only a battlefield victory, it was a turning point in strategic thinking. In the broader sweep of history, Saipan stands as the fulcrum upon which the Pacific War shifted from defensive campaigns to the final offensive against Japan itself. It was the moment when American forces moved from containing Japan's empire to dismantling it at its core. It was the moment when the Japanese government began to collapse under the weight of military defeat and political upheaval. And it was the moment when the American public, though weary of war, could finally glimpse the possibility of ultimate victory. The battle's legacy was not only written in blood, but also in strategy, politics, and technology. Saipan was more than an island. It was the gateway to Japan's destruction, and the stage upon which the Pacific War entered its final act.